Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most beautiful paradoxes. Imagine two women in 1856 standing before a church altar, exchanging rings and vows of eternal devotion. Their families are there, the community celebrates, society approves wholeheartedly. Now imagine those same two women kissing in public, writing passionate love letters, sharing a bed for 50 years, and willing each other their entire estates, still accepted, still celebrated, still completely, utterly normal. How is this possible in an era when women couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, and were told their bodies existed solely for their husbands? The answer is stranger and more beautiful than you might think. Because Victorian society created a loophole so vast, so unexpected, that it allowed women to build lives together in plain sight, hiding their deepest truths behind the most transparent of veils. Before we slip into this world of ribboned letters and intertwined lives, I need to ask you something. If this story speaks to you, if you find yourself curious about the women history tried to erase, would you take just a moment to subscribe? Hit that like button if you appreciate the research that goes into bringing these forgotten voices back to life. And I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? Are you in bed in California watching the sunset, walking through London rain with earbuds in? Tell me in the comments where this story finds you tonight, and what draws you to these hidden histories. Your words honestly make the hundreds of hours of research worth it. Now, dim those lights, let the world outside fade away and settle in. Tonight, we are stepping through a door that was hidden in plain sight for over a century. Let me paint you a picture of the Victorian world, because understanding the cage helps us understand how some birds learn to sing within it. The year is 1837. A young woman ascends to the British throne. Her name is Victoria, and she will reign for 64 years, giving her name to an entire era. But she does more than rule an empire. She codifies a way of life so rigid, so structured, that it makes our modern social rules look like suggestions scribbled on a napkin. In this world, men and women occupy separate spheres as distinct as earth and sky. Men inhabit the public realm, business, politics, clubs, universities. Women are confined to the domestic sphere, home, children, needlework, prayer. And here is where it gets fascinating. A respectable unmarried woman in 1850 cannot simply walk up to a gentleman and introduce herself. That would be scandalous beyond measure. She must wait to be formally introduced through mutual acquaintances. She cannot use his first name until they are engaged. She cannot be alone in a room with him without a chaperone present. She cannot even accept flowers without understanding the complex language each bloom conveys. The rules are suffocating, the walls are high, and yet when that same young woman wants to spend time with another young woman, every door swings open. She can write her 10 letters a week. She can hold her hand during church services. She can sleep in her bed when visiting overnight. She can kiss her goodbye at train stations. She can declare her the love of her life in poetry. And not only is this permitted, it is actively encouraged. Why? The answer lies in one of the most spectacularly wrong assumptions in medical history. Victorian doctors, almost exclusively men, mind you, believed with absolute certainty that women lacked sexual desire. They genuinely thought women were essentially angelic creatures, floating above the messy business of physical passion. In their minds, women endured marital relations solely to produce children, finding no pleasure in the act itself. Some medical textbooks of the era actually state that a woman who enjoys physical intimacy is displaying signs of mental illness or moral corruption. This belief, so monumentally incorrect, created an enormous blind spot. If women do not experience sexual desire, the thinking went, then women spending intimate time together poses absolutely no moral danger. They are simply expressing the tender emotional nature that makes them so perfectly suited to motherhood and homemaking. Two women sharing passionate friendship is not only innocent, it is practically holy. The Victorians even had a special term for these relationships. They called them romantic friendships, and they were everywhere. Picture a typical middle-class parlour in 1855 London. Two young women sit close together on a settee, so close their shoulders touch. One reads aloud from a novel while the other works on embroidery that will eventually be gifted to her companion. Their mothers chat nearby, completely unconcerned. Later, the women will retreat to one of their bedrooms, again with full parental approval, to write in journals they share back and forth, adding entries for each other to read. Before they part that evening, they will exchange locks of hair, carefully cut and tied with ribbon, to be woven into jewellery that each will wear every day. This is not hidden. This is not shameful. This is normal. But let us talk about what normal meant in practice, because the details are extraordinary. Women in romantic friendships wrote to each other in language that would make modern romance novels blush. We are not talking about "Dear friend, I hope this letter finds you well." We are talking about declarations like, "You are the sun that lights my days and the moon that guards my sleep. I count each hour until I am in your arms again. I am yours entirely, body and soul, until death and beyond." These letters were not hidden in secret compartments. Families read them. Society smiled approvingly, because everyone knew, or thought they knew, that women were simply more emotional, more expressive, more sentimental than men. This was just how female friendship looked. They wore each other's hair in lockets around their necks. They commissioned double portraits. They were buried in shared plots. And here is the truly remarkable part. Many of these women never married men. They simply lived together, sometimes for decades, managing households as a unit, pooling their resources, making a life that looked, to any modern observer, exactly like a marriage. There was even a term for this that emerged later in the century. They called it a Boston marriage, named after a novel by Henry James about two women who build a life together. And again, this was seen as respectable, even admirable. Two educated, refined women choosing intellectual companionship over the messiness of dealing with husbands? How perfectly sensible. But here is where we need to pause and ask ourselves a crucial question. Were these women really just friends? Or were they hiding in plain sight, using society's blind spot to build lives that would have been impossible otherwise? The honest answer is, we do not know for certain in every case. And that ambiguity, that uncertainty, is actually part of what makes this story so compelling. Because some of these women left us no doubt whatsoever about the nature of their feelings. They wrote it down in coded diaries. They described their physical relationships in explicit terms. They created their own marriage ceremonies. We will meet some of them very soon. But others, perhaps many others, genuinely may have experienced their friendships as intensely emotional and romantic without any sexual dimension, and that is valid too. The spectrum of human connection is vast and strange and beautiful. What matters is that Victorian society created a space, accidental though it may have been, where women could choose each other, prioritize each other, build lives with each other, and be respected for it. Think about the contrast for a moment. A woman in 1860 who tried to have a career in medicine or law would be laughed out of the room. A woman who tried to vote would be arrested. A woman who divorced her husband, even an abusive one, would be socially ruined. But a woman who chose to live her entire adult life with another woman, never marrying, sharing everything, that woman could be a pillar of her community. It is a paradox wrapped in irony. tied up with a ribbon made of hair. Now you might be wondering, what about working class women? Because so far we have been talking primarily about middle and upper class ladies with the luxury of choice, and you are right to wonder. The truth is, working class women had less freedom in some ways and more in others. They had to work, which meant they spent more time in mixed company, under less supervision, but they also had less privacy, less space, less ability to craft independent lives. The documented romantic friendships we know most about come from women who could read and write, who had time to maintain correspondences, who left diaries and letters behind. But even in working-class communities, particularly in textile towns and industrial cities, we find evidence of women pairing off, sharing lodgings, supporting each other through hard times. The bonds were there, they simply were not written down as often. And this brings us to one of the most frustrating aspects of this history. So many of these stories have been lost. Families burned letters after women died, embarrassed by what they perceived as excessive emotion. Diaries were destroyed, photographs were separated. The historical record has been deliberately scrubbed, and we are left trying to reconstruct these lives from fragments and hints and the few testimonies that survived. But some did survive. Oh, some definitely survived. And those stories, the ones we can verify, that we can trace, that give us names and dates and undeniable evidence, those stories are remarkable. There is something deeply moving about imagining a world where women had permission to love each other openly, even if that permission came from a misunderstanding. Even if society thought they were just playing at emotion, just practicing for the real relationships they would supposedly have with men someday. The women knew. They knew what they were building. They knew what they meant to each other. And they used every tool available to make their relationships visible, permanent, real. They wore each other's hair, they exchanged rings, they made vows, they created legal arrangements to protect each other. They built households. They grew old together. They were buried together, all in plain sight, all perfectly acceptable, all hiding in the open behind the veil of romantic friendship. The system was not designed to give women this freedom. It was designed to control them, to limit them, to keep them in their place. But within its rigid structures, women found cracks wide enough to build entire lives. They took the script they were given, the one about pure, emotional, passionless female nature, and they rewrote it to serve themselves. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. We will explore the heartbreak, the limitations, the women who were forced to give up these relationships when they married men. We will talk about the medical establishment that eventually caught on and tried to pathologize what they had previously encouraged. We will discuss the costs and the compromises. But tonight, in this first part of our journey, I want us to simply sit with the wonder of it, the sheer audacity of creating space for love in a world that was not supposed to allow it, the creativity required to build a life worth living within such narrow constraints. Because those Victorian women, with their coded letters and hair jewellery and shared beds and 50-year partnerships, they were not just surviving. They were not just making do, they were thriving. They were building something beautiful in a beautiful broken world. So when you hear about romantic friendships in Victorian literature, or Boston marriages in turn-of-the-century America, or women who never married but always had a special companion, now you know what you are really hearing about. You are hearing about women who looked at the walls around them and said, "Fine, we will work within your rules, but we will make those rules serve us." And they did. For decades, they absolutely did. Now that we understand the world these women inhabited, the paradox that made their lives possible, we are ready to meet them. Real women, real names, real lives. Women who left us diaries and letters and legal documents that prove, beyond any doubt, exactly what they were creating with each other. Next, we step into one of the most famous love stories of the 18th century, a story that begins with a midnight escape, two determined women, and a scandal that somehow transformed into a legend and that would inspire generations. The ladies of Llangollen are waiting for us, and trust me, their story is worth every minute. Picture a spring night in 1778. Two women stand in the darkness outside a grand Irish manor house, their hearts pounding so hard they can hear nothing else. One is 39 years old, the other just 23. They are dressed in men's riding clothes, their few precious possessions tied in bundles. They have planned this moment for months, writing coded letters, stealing conversations in hallways, waiting for the perfect night when the moon would be dark enough to hide them. This is an elopement, but not the kind you are imagining. Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby are about to do something so scandalous, so unthinkable, that their families will chase them down like criminals. They are running away together. Two women, no man involved, no marriage waiting at the end of their journey, just each other, a cottage in Wales, and a dream of a life built entirely on their own terms. And here is the twist that makes this story so perfectly, wonderfully strange. Within a decade, they will be the most celebrated couple in Britain. Royalty will visit them. Poets will write about them. They will become legends. But on this night in 1778, they are just two terrified women stealing away into the darkness, not knowing if they will make it past the first mile. Let me tell you how we got here. Because Eleanor and Sarah's story does not start with that dramatic escape. It starts years earlier, in the suffocating world of Anglo-Irish aristocracy. Eleanor Butler was born in 1739 into one of Ireland's most prominent Catholic families. By the time she reached her late 30s, she was facing a fate she found unbearable. Her family wanted her to enter a convent. Now, this was not unusual. Unmarried upper-class women often became nuns, especially in Catholic families. It was considered respectable, even honourable. But Eleanor did not want to be a nun. She did not want to marry either. She wanted something else entirely, though she could not yet name it. Then she met Sarah. Sarah Ponsonby was born in 1755 to a wealthy family, but her childhood was marked by tragedy. Orphaned young, she was sent to live with relatives who saw her primarily as a burden and a marriage prospect. By the time she was a teenager, Sarah was being pressured to marry a man she found absolutely repulsive. The historical records suggest he may have been significantly older and possibly abusive. Sarah was desperate to escape, but where could a young woman with no independent income possibly go? The two women met in social circles, as upper-class Irish women did, and something sparked. We do not have the early letters, those were destroyed or lost, but we know from later writings that they recognized something in each other, a shared desire for a different kind of life, a deep, immediate connection that both women described as transformative. They began to plan. Now think about what they were planning. They had no legal right to their own money. They had no ability to sign contracts. They had no socially acceptable way to live together. If they simply announced they wanted to set up a household together, their families would have stopped them instantly. They decided to run. The first escape attempt happened in April of 1778. They made it about 12 miles before they were caught, dragged back, and separated. Can you imagine the humiliation, the fear? They'd committed themselves to each other, burned their bridges, and failed. Most people would have given up. Eleanor and Sarah tried again. 1 month later they escaped a second time, and this time they made it. They fled to Wales, to a place called Llangollen, and they found a cottage called Plas Newydd. It was small, rather run down, and absolutely perfect. With the tiny bit of money Eleanor managed to secure, About £200 a year, barely enough to live on, they rented it and began to build the life they had dreamed of. Here is where the story takes its extraordinary turn. You would expect scandal, ostracism, families cutting them off completely. And there was some of that initially. But within just a few years, something remarkable happened. Society decided that Eleanor and Sarah were not shameful. They were romantic. How did this happen? How did two women who literally ran away together become celebrated instead of condemned? Part of it was their story, the dramatic escape, the cottage in the Welsh countryside, the devotion to each other. It fit perfectly into the romantic ideals that were sweeping through European culture. People love a good love story even when, or perhaps especially when, they do not fully understand what kind of love they're witnessing. But Eleanor and Sarah were also brilliant strategists. They crafted their public image very carefully. They presented themselves as intellectual companions pursuing a pastoral ideal, two refined ladies who had rejected the corruption and superficiality of high society for a life of simple pleasures, reading, walking, gardening, improving their cottage. They dressed in a distinctive way that became their trademark. They wore masculine-style riding habits, top hats, and cropped their hair short. This was unusual, certainly, but they framed it as practical clothing for country life, not as any kind of gender rebellion. And the Victorian tendency to see women as essentially asexual worked in their favour. Two ladies living together in intellectual pursuit, how charmingly eccentric, how perfectly innocent. The cottage itself became part of their legend. They spent 50 years improving Plas Newydd, adding Gothic touches, collecting carved oak, creating gardens. It became a kind of shrine to their partnership, and people wanted to see it. They wanted to meet the famous ladies of Llangollen. And oh, the visitors they received. This is where it gets truly wild. Queen Charlotte visited them. Think about that. The Queen of England visited two women who had run away from their families to live together. She found them delightful. Lord Byron came, William Wordsworth came, Sir Walter Scott came, the Duke of Wellington came. These were not fringe figures. These were the most famous, most powerful, most socially conservative people in Britain. And they all made pilgrimages to see Eleanor and Sarah. The visitor's book at Plas Newydd read like a who's who of British society. Aristocrats, writers, politicians, they all came and they all left charmed. They wrote about the ladies in their letters and journals, describing them as refined, witty, devoted to each other in a way that was touching and admirable. Wordsworth wrote a poem about them. Let that sink in. One of the greatest poets in the English language wrote verse celebrating two women who had eloped together. The poem is called To the Lady Eleanor Butler and the Honourable Miss Ponsonby, and it praises their private life and friendship in glowing terms. But here is the question that historians still argue about. Did people actually not know, or did they know and simply choose to look away? Some of their neighbours definitely gossiped. There are records of whispered rumours, speculation about the exact nature of their relationship, a few crude jokes in private letters, but publicly, socially, the acceptable interpretation was that Eleanor and Sarah were romantic friends. Passionate, yes. Devoted, absolutely. But innocent, pure, just two ladies who loved each other's company. And Eleanor and Sarah never contradicted this interpretation. They never announced we are lovers. They never demanded to be understood as anything other than what society wanted to see. They simply lived their lives together openly and let people think what they wanted to think. They called each other my love and my better half in letters. They wore matching rings. They kept journals that they shared, writing entries for each other to read. When one was ill, the other nursed her with devotion that went far beyond normal friendship. They slept in the same bed for 50 years. They managed their tiny household income together, making every decision jointly. They grew old together. Sarah outlived Eleanor by just 2 years. When Eleanor died in 1829 at age 90, Sarah was devastated. She died in 1831 at age 76. They are buried together in the same churchyard, along with their beloved servant Mary Carroll, who had lived with them for decades and was part of their household family. The gravestone does not say friends, it does not say companions, it simply lists their names together as they had been in life. Now, were Eleanor and Sarah lovers in the physical sense? We do not have explicit evidence either way. They did not leave us coded diaries describing sexual encounters. But does that matter? They ran away together. They built a life together. They chose each other over everything and everyone else. They were together for 50 years. They are buried together. If that is not a marriage, what is? What makes their story so powerful is not just what they did, but when they did it. 1778 was not exactly a progressive era. This was well before any kind of LGBTQ rights movement, before the word lesbian even entered common usage, before there was any social model for what they were creating. They had to invent it themselves, and they succeeded so completely that they became icons. Other women looked at them and saw possibility. If Eleanor and Sarah could do it, maybe others could too. The ladies of Llangollen proved that women could choose each other, could build lives together, could be respected for it. But, and this is important, their success depended on specific circumstances. They had just enough money to survive independently. They had no children to care for. They lived in a remote enough location that they could control their own narrative. They fit just enough into acceptable categories: eccentric gentry, intellectual recluses, romantic friends, that society could tolerate them. Not every woman had those advantages. Not every pair of women who wanted to build a life together could do what Eleanor and Sarah did. For every successful partnership that history recorded, how many others were torn apart? How many women were forced into marriages they did not want? How many relationships were destroyed before they could even begin? These are questions we cannot fully answer because those stories were not written down. Those women did not become legend. They simply disappeared into the historical silence, their choices and dreams and heartbreaks unrecorded. But Eleanor and Sarah's story survived. It survived because they were visible, because they were celebrated, because they fit just barely within what their society could accept. And that makes their story both inspiring and a little bit heartbreaking, because it reminds us how many others did not get to be visible, did not get to be celebrated. Still, on a quiet night in Wales, if you visit Llangollen, you can see Plas Newid. You can walk through the rooms they decorated together. You can see their portraits side by side. You can stand at their grave and read their names, together for eternity. You can ask yourself, what would I risk for the person I love? What would I give up? How far would I run? Eleanor and Sarah risked everything, and against all odds, they won. But their story, remarkable as it is, represents just one way Victorian women navigated the complex world of forbidden friendship. Because while Eleanor and Sarah became legends, another woman was living a very different kind of truth, one she hid in code, in encrypted journals that would not be read for over 100 years. A woman who did not run away to Wales, but stayed home and fought to claim her inheritance, her independence, and the right to love whom she chose. Her name was Anne Lister, and where Eleanor and Sarah worked within the system, Anne Lister decided to bend it to her will. She wore all black, dressed like a man, seduced married women, kept detailed records of her sexual conquests, and somehow, became one of the most respected landowners in Yorkshire. Her story is waiting for us, and I promise you it is unlike anything you have ever heard. The people of Halifax, Yorkshire, had a nickname for her. They whispered it in shops, muttered it in taverns, said it with a mixture of amusement and unease. Gentleman Jack. She walked through their streets dressed entirely in black, her coat cut in a masculine style, her stride confident and unmistakably unfeminine. She tipped her hat to ladies as a gentleman would. She managed coal mines and negotiated business deals that left seasoned merchants stammering. And every single night she went home to Shibden Hall and wrote in her diary using a code so complex that it would not be cracked for over 150 years. What was Anne Lister hiding? Well, let me put it this way. If her neighbours had been able to read those diaries, her life would have been very different. Because Anne was not just living with a female companion in romantic friendship, the way Eleanor and Sarah did. Anne was documenting her sexual relationships with women in explicit and apologetic hell. She was marking her orgasms with a simple symbol, the letter X, and she was doing all of this while being one of the most respected landowners in Yorkshire. How is that possible? How did she get away with it? That is the story we are diving into now, and I promise you it is remarkable. Anne Lister was born in 1791 into a family that owned Shibden Hall, a beautiful manor house that had been in the Lister family for generations. From the very beginning, Anne was not like other girls, and I do not mean that in some vague feel-good way. I mean she was genuinely, measurably different in ways that terrified her family. When she was 7 years old, she was already climbing out of windows and running wild through the town when she was supposed to be quietly learning needlework. Her family sent her away to boarding school, hoping the discipline would tame her. It did not. Instead, it gave her something far more dangerous, her first love affair with another girl. Anne fell deeply in love with a fellow student named Eliza Rain, and this was not puppy love, not a girlish crush. This was serious. They made promises to each other. They talked about a future together, and when they were eventually separated, Anne was devastated. But here is what sets Anne apart from almost every other woman we will talk about. She did not treat this as a phase. She did not convince herself it was just friendship. On January 29, 1821, at age 29, Anne Lister wrote in her diary, and I'm going to quote this directly because it is extraordinary, "I love and only love the fairer sex and thus beloved by them in turn. My heart revolts from any other love than theirs." Read that again. I love and only love the fairer sex. This is 1821. There is no LGBTQ movement. There is no language for what she is describing. The word lesbian barely exists in English yet. But Anne knows exactly who she is, and she is not confused or apologetic about it. She went on to have a series of relationships with women. Some were brief encounters she called scrapes. Others were sustained affairs that lasted years. And she wrote about all of them in her diary in meticulous detail, using her secret code. The code itself is fascinating. Anne created it using a mixture of the Greek alphabet, mathematical symbols, astrological signs, and her own invented characters. She used it specifically for passages about her sexuality, her finances, and anything else she wanted to keep private. The rest of her diary is in plain English, notes about the weather, visits from neighbours, business transactions. But when she wanted to record something intimate, she switched to code. For example, she would write a sentence in English about having tea with a lady friend, and then switch to code to describe what happened after the tea was finished. The code was sophisticated enough that when her family members occasionally glanced at her diaries, they saw nothing alarming, just Anne's daily records full of ordinary business. But what she was actually recording was an extraordinarily active love life. Her longest and most passionate relationship was with a woman named Mariana Belcom. They met when Anne was in her 20s, and the connection was instant and intense. There was just one problem. Mariana was about to marry a wealthy man named Charles Lawton. Now, you might think this ended the affair. It did not. Mariana married Charles for his money and social position, exactly as society expected her to. And then she continued her relationship with Anne for years. Anne's diary is full of anguished entries about being the secret love of a married woman, about stolen moments, about the torture of sharing Mariana with a man Anne considered boring and beneath them both. In one entry, Anne records actually hoping that Charles would die young so she could move in with Mariana under the guise of comforting a grieving widow. That was the plan. Use romantic friendship as cover for what was actually a marriage. But Charles did not die young, and Mariana, for all her passion for Anne, was not willing to give up the security and respectability of marriage. This caused Anne tremendous pain, but it also clarified something for her. She decided she wanted her own partner, a woman who would choose her fully, a woman with enough money that they could build an independent life together. So Anne went looking, and I mean that literally. She travelled, she socialised, she actively courted women. She had affairs in Paris. She pursued women in the Lake District. She was, by any measure, dating. Strategically, deliberately dating. Meanwhile, she was also managing Shibden Hall with extraordinary skill. When her uncle died in 1826 and left her a share of the estate, Anne threw herself into improving it. She studied geology and engineering. She invested in coal mines and canals. She negotiated with businessmen who initially dismissed her, and then found themselves outmaneuvered by this woman in black who understood contracts better than they did. Her diary records moments of pure satisfaction when she bested men in business. She knew they underestimated her. She used it. And all the while she kept searching for the right woman to share her life with. She had very specific criteria. The woman needed to have money of her own. Anne was practical about this. She needed to be willing to live at Shibden. And she needed to understand what Anne was offering. Not friendship, not companionship, but marriage in everything but name. In 1832, Anne met Anne Walker. Anne Walker was a neighbouring heiress, wealthy but timid, younger than Anne by several years. She had been raised in a sheltered environment and suffered from anxiety and what we would now recognise as depression. Anne saw her as someone who needed protection, guidance and love. Anne saw Anne as someone strong enough to lean on. It was not a relationship of equals in the way Anne and Mariana had been, but it was something else, a genuine partnership where both women got what they needed. Anne got financial security and a committed partner. Anne got someone who made her feel safe and cherished. Anne courted Anne with determination and tenderness. She visited her constantly. She wrote her letters. She gave her gifts. She made her intentions unmistakably clear. This was not just friendship, this was courtship. And on Easter Monday, March 30th, 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker took communion together at Holy Trinity Church in Goodramgate, York. They had agreed in advance that this would be their marriage ceremony. They were taking the sacrament together as a pledge to each other before God to be partners for life. Think about what that means. They walked into a church in public and performed what they both understood to be a marriage ceremony. No one stopped them. The priest had no idea what they were doing. It was hiding in plain sight, taken to its absolute extreme. After the ceremony, they exchanged rings. They moved into Shibden Hall together. They travelled Europe together as a couple. Anne gave Annie control over her financial affairs. They made wills leaving everything to each other. They were, in every practical and emotional sense, married. Anne's diary entry for that day is extraordinary. She marked it with a special symbol. She described the communion as their union. She called Anne her wife. And Halifax society? They gossiped, certainly. They called Anne Gentleman Jack with varying degrees of affection and mockery, but they also accepted her as a landowner, a businesswoman, a respectable member of the community. Anne Walker, now living at Shibden Hall with Anne, was seen as her companion. Eccentric, yes, but not beyond the pale. How did Anne manage this? How did she live so openly as a lesbian? And yes, that is what she was, by any definition, in 1830s Yorkshire. Part of it was class. Anne owned land, employed people, paid taxes, contributed to the local economy. That brought a lot of tolerance. Part of it was her sheer confidence. She did not apologize or explain. She simply lived as though she had every right to do exactly what she was doing. And part of it was that same societal blind spot we talked about earlier. People genuinely struggled to believe that women could have sexual relationships with each other. Even when the evidence was right in front of them, they looked away. But Anne's life was not without complications. Her relationship with Anne was sometimes difficult. Anne's mental health struggles put strain on them both. Anne's forceful personality could be overwhelming. They had arguments, separations, reconciliations, all the messy reality of any long-term relationship. And then, in 1839, they decided to travel together. They went to Russia, then to the Caucasus. Anne was always adventurous, always curious about the world beyond Yorkshire. But this trip would be her last. In September 1840, while travelling in Georgia, Anne was bitten by an insect. The bite became infected. Within days, she developed a fever. Within a week, she was dead. She was just 49 years old. Anne Walker, devastated and alone in a foreign country, arranged to have Anne's body preserved and transported back to England. Can you imagine that journey? Grieving your wife, because that's what Anne was doing, grieving her wife, while managing the logistics of moving a body hundreds of miles in a foreign country in 1840. But she did it. She brought Anne home to Shibden Hall, and she brought something else with her, the last 2 volumes of Anne's diaries. Those precious books made the long journey back to Yorkshire, and they remained at Shibden Hall for the next 150 years. Here is where the story gets truly remarkable. Anne's relatives inherited Shibden Hall and all of Anne's possessions, including 26 volumes of diaries. In the 1890s, a descendant named John Lister found the diaries and began reading them. The plain English parts fascinated him. They were full of local history. So he started publishing excerpts in the Halifax Guardian. Then one night, he and a friend named Arthur Burrell decided to try cracking the code. When they succeeded and started reading the coded sections, they were shocked, absolutely scandalized. This was 1890-something, remember, and Britain had just passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, the law that would later be used against Oscar Wilde. Sodomy was a serious crime, and here was documentary evidence that a respected member of the Lister family had been having sexual relationships with women. Arthur Burrell told John Lister to burn the diaries, destroy them, erase this shameful history. John Lister refused. Think about that decision. He was risking his family's reputation, his own standing in the community, possible legal consequences, but he looked at those diaries and saw something worth saving, so he hid them. He kept them safe, and they stayed hidden at Shibden Hall until 1933, when they were finally given to the Halifax archives. But even then, they were not read. The code kept Anne's secrets for decades more. It was not until 1982 that a researcher named Helena Whitbread was given access to the diaries and the key to the code. She spent 5 years decoding volumes and volumes of Anne's writing. When Whitbread published her first book of Anne's diaries in 1988, it caused a sensation. Here was documentary evidence of a lesbian relationship from the 1820s and 30s, written in the woman's own hand, describing her life in extraordinary detail. It changed our understanding of Victorian sexuality, of women's history, of what was possible in that era. In 2019, the diaries were added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register, recognized as documents of outstanding universal value. Anne Lister's words, her secret code, her insistence on documenting her own truth, all of it survived to tell us something crucial about the past, that people like Anne existed, that they loved deeply, lived boldly, created spaces for themselves even in hostile times, that they were not waiting to be liberated by some future generation. They were living their truths as best they could, right then, in their own moment. Anne Lister was not perfect. She could be arrogant, manipulative, selfish. She was a product of her class and time with all the privileges and prejudices that implies. But she was also brave in ways most of us will never have to be. She loved women, she wrote it down, she built a life around that love, and she survived. Her story reminds us that LGBTQ history is not just about oppression and tragedy. It is also about strategy, creativity, resilience, and joy. Anne Lister had a good life. She loved and was loved. She managed an estate, travelled the world, wore whatever she wanted, and married the woman she chose. Not bad for someone living in 1830s England, but Anne's story, powerful as it is, represents just one thread in the complex tapestry of Victorian female relationships, because while she was recording her life in secret code, other women were expressing their love through a very different medium, one that was completely public, socially acceptable, and yet hauntingly intimate. They were giving each other pieces of themselves to wear, quite literally. And this practice created some of the most beautiful and most eerie objects in Victorian culture. Let me show you what happens when love becomes something you can hold in your hand, something woven from the very essence of the beloved. There is an object sitting in a museum in London right now that would probably make you deeply uncomfortable if you saw it in someone's home today. It is a bracelet, delicately woven, intricate and beautiful, and it is made entirely from human hair. Not just any hair, the hair of someone's beloved, carefully cut, painstakingly braided, woven into patterns so complex they look like lace. Some bracelets contain hair from multiple people, whole families, entire friend groups, networks of love rendered into something you could wear on your wrist. To us, this seems macabre, even grotesque. Hair belongs on heads, not in jewellery boxes, but to Victorian women, this was the ultimate expression of intimacy. Because hair, they believed, was the one part of a person that never truly died. It survived. It lasted. It carried something essential about the person it came from. And when two women wanted to declare their love for each other in a way that was permanent, public, and yet strangely invisible, they gave each other their hair. Let me take you into this world, because it is stranger and more beautiful than you might imagine. The practice of hair jewellery goes back centuries, but it absolutely exploded in popularity during the Victorian era. And when I say exploded, I mean England was importing 50 tons of human hair per year by the mid-1800s. 50 tons. That is not a typo. Now, some of that hair was for wigs and hairpieces, certainly, but a substantial amount was for jewellery and mourning art. And here is the crucial thing to understand. Hair jewellery was not just about death. Yes, mourning jewellery was a huge part of it, especially after Prince Albert died in 1861 and Queen Victoria turned grief into a national aesthetic. But long before that, and running parallel to it, hair jewellery was about love between the living. Women exchanged locks of hair the way teenagers today exchange friendship bracelets. A woman would cut a piece of her hair, tie it with ribbon, and give it to her dearest friend. That friend would wear it in a locket, or have it woven into a bracelet, or incorporated into a brooch. It was a piece of that person, literally, worn close to the heart. Think about what that means in an era before photography was common or affordable. You could not carry a picture of your beloved in your pocket. You could not save their voice in a recording. But you could carry their actual physical essence, their DNA, woven into jewellery that touched your skin every single day. The magazine Godey's Lady's Book, which was hugely influential in both America and England, published this absolutely beautiful sentiment in 1860. They wrote, and I am quoting here, "Hair is at once the most delicate and lasting of our materials and survives us, like love. It is so light, so gentle, so escaping from the idea of death that, with a lock of hair belonging to a child or friend, we may almost look up to heaven. Survives us, like love." Think about that phrase. Hair was seen as a physical manifestation of love itself, something that endures beyond the body, beyond even death. But let us talk about what this looked like in practice, particularly between women friends, because this is where it gets really interesting. Two young women, let us call them Margaret and Elizabeth, become close friends in the 1840s. They're both from respectable middle-class families. They spend hours together, reading, walking, sharing secrets. Their friendship is romantic in exactly the way we discussed earlier. Passionate, devoted, publicly acceptable. One day, Elizabeth announces she is going to visit relatives in another city for several months. The separation feels unbearable to both women, so they decide to exchange locks of hair before Elizabeth leaves. This is not a casual thing. They choose a special evening. They sit together, probably in one of their bedrooms, and carefully cut pieces of each other's hair. They might cry a little. They definitely make promises to write every week, to think of each other every day, to preserve this token forever. Elizabeth takes Margaret's hair and has it woven into a bracelet. Every time she looks at her wrist, she thinks of Margaret. Margaret keeps Elizabeth's hair in a locket that she wears around her neck, tucked under her dress, resting against her heart. When they write to each other, they reference the hair. "I wore your bracelet to church today and felt you were with me. I touched the locket and imagined your hand in mine." The hair becomes a language, a way of saying things they cannot say directly, and their families see this as perfectly normal. Sweet even. How lovely that the girls care for each other so much. How touching that they have these tokens of friendship. But here is where it gets complicated. Some of these relationships were clearly romantic friendships in the innocent sense that society assumed. But others were women who were deeply, romantically, possibly sexually in love with each other, using hair jewellery as a socially acceptable way to claim each other. How can we tell the difference? Often we cannot. And that is precisely the point. The same gesture, giving someone your hair, could mean friendship, could mean romantic love, could mean something in between that we do not have good words for. The ambiguity was the shield that made it safe, but sometimes the clues are unmistakable. When two women commission matching bracelets made from both of their hair braided together, that is significant. When they exchange rings with hair sealed inside, exchanged in a private ceremony, that looks an awful lot like a commitment ritual. When one woman's diary describes cutting her beloved's hair in language that is explicitly sensual, describing the intimacy of the act, the softness of the hair between her fingers, the way her friend's neck looked when she bent forward, well, that is not just friendship. The Victorian hair artist Mark Campbell published a guide in 1867 called Self-Instructor in the Art of Hairwork. It is fascinating because it reveals just how widespread this practice was. Campbell writes that his book is for persons wishing to preserve and weave into lasting mementos the hair of a deceased father, mother, sister, brother, or child. Notice what is on that list. Notice what is conspicuously absent. Husbands and wives are not mentioned, because hair jewellery between married couples was less common. This was primarily a practice of blood family, and, significantly, female friends. The book gives detailed instructions on two main techniques. Table work meant braiding the hair into jewellery, bracelets, watch chains, rings, earrings. Palette work meant laying hair flat and creating pictures or patterns, often under glass in a brooch or pendant. And these were not simple crafts. Some of the patterns were extraordinarily complex. Women spent hours, days, weeks creating these pieces. The more elaborate the piece, the more time invested, the more the gift meant. You were literally weaving your time, your attention, your devotion into this object. Imagine sitting by a window, natural light streaming in, your hands working with strands of hair so fine you can barely see them. You're creating a bracelet for your dearest friend. Every twist of the braid is a thought of her. Every knot is a memory. The finished piece will be imperfect. Your hands are not professional, but that imperfection is part of its value. She will wear something you made for her, from a piece of yourself touched by your hands for hours. That is intimacy. That is devotion. And it is completely invisible to anyone who does not understand the language. Now there were professional hair workers too, and this is where things get a bit scandalous. By the 1850s, there were workshops in London and in other major cities where you could send hair and have it made into jewellery. These workshops advertised in ladies' magazines. They offered catalogues with dozens of patterns to choose from. But there were problems, major problems. Some workshops were swapping out the hair you sent for horsehair, which was easier to work with, or mixing in hair from strangers. There were actual scandals reported in newspapers about women discovering their precious jewellery did not contain their loved one's hair at all. The horror this provoked tells you how important authenticity was. The whole point was that this was a piece of your specific person, their DNA, their essence. Having it swapped for horsehair was not just fraud, it was a kind of spiritual violation. So many women insisted on doing the work themselves. That way they knew for certain the bracelet they wore contained hair from the woman they loved, touched only by their own hands. Queen Victoria herself was a passionate devotee of hair jewellery. After Prince Albert died in 1861, she wore a locket containing his hair every single day for the remaining 40 years of her life. She commissioned elaborate pieces, brooches, bracelets, rings, all incorporating Albert's hair. She gave hair jewellery to her children and favoured courtiers, but Victoria also had hair jewellery from when Albert was alive. She had pieces made for their anniversaries, their children's births, special occasions, and this was true for many couples. Hair jewellery was not just about mourning, it was about marking important moments, creating physical records of love. But the most common exchange, by far, was between women friends, mothers and daughters, sisters, and those intense friendships that might be romantic, might be sexual, might be something society had no name for. There is a collection of hair jewellery at the Victorian Albert Museum in London. You can go see it if you ever visit. Hundreds of pieces, bracelets, brooches, rings, elaborate wreaths under glass. Each one represents a relationship. Each one was precious to someone. And here is what strikes me every time I think about these objects. They were public and private. A woman could wear a bracelet made from her beloved's hair to church, to social calls, to family dinners. Everyone could see it. Many people would know it was hair jewellery. That was fashionable. That was normal. But only she knew whose hair it was. Only she knew what it meant to her. Only she felt the weight of it on her wrist. The constant gentle reminder that she carried a piece of her beloved everywhere she went. It is hiding in plain sight, taken to a literal physical level. The love is visible, but its true nature is known only to the two people involved. Now, let me tell you about a specific piece that survived with its story intact. In a small museum in Massachusetts, there is a bracelet made in approximately 1850. It contains hair from two women, braided together in an alternating pattern. Dark brown and golden blonde twisted around each other in an endless loop. The museum records indicate it was found among the possessions of a woman named Catherine who never married. Her will left the bracelet to a woman named Mary, described as her dearest friend and companion. They had lived together for 37 years. The bracelet was in a special box, wrapped in a letter that has unfortunately been lost, but the bracelet survived. You can see where the clasp is worn from decades of being fastened and unfastened. You can see where the hair has faded slightly in some spots, probably from exposure to sunlight. You can see how carefully it was made, how the two colours were deliberately intertwined. Looking at it, you can almost imagine the scene when it was created. Two women sitting close together, one holding the other's hair, deciding how to arrange the pattern. Did they talk about what it meant? Did they need to? When Catherine fastened that bracelet around her wrist each morning for 37 years, what did she think about? When Mary inherited it, did she wear it herself or keep it in the box, too precious and painful to touch? We will never know. But we know they found a way to claim each other that their society permitted. They took the tools available to them, hair, jewellery, the language of friendship, and they built something permanent. And that is just one bracelet. There are thousands more. Tens of thousands, probably. Most of them lost or destroyed or sitting in attics and estate sales with their stories forgotten. Each one represents two people who loved each other enough to exchange pieces of themselves. Each one is a small act of courage, of creativity, of insistence that this relationship matters, that it will be marked, that it will be remembered. The practice of hair jewellery faded after World War I. By the 1920s it was seen as old-fashioned, morbid, unhygienic. Photography had become cheap and accessible. You could carry pictures now. You did not need hair. But also I think the meaning had shifted. As society became more aware of lesbianism as a concept, as women's intimate friendships came under more scrutiny, the innocent cover that had protected hair exchange started to evaporate. Women became more careful, more guarded. The language of romantic friendship fell out of use, and with it went this beautiful, strange practice of literally wearing your beloved. Today there is a small revival of hair jewellery, mostly in alternative communities. Some people still commission pieces for weddings or as mourning jewellery, but it will never again have the cultural centrality it had in the Victorian era, when every respectable woman understood the language, when giving your hair to someone meant something specific and powerful. What remains are the objects, the bracelets in museums, the brooches in private collections, the photographs of Victorian women wearing dark ribbons around their throats, lockets resting above their hearts, bracelets circling their wrists. And if you look closely at those photographs, if you squint at the grainy images, you can sometimes see what is inside the lockets, what is woven into the bracelets. You can see the hair. And you can wonder, whose was it? What did it mean? What story has been lost? Those questions lead us to another way Victorian women spoke to each other in code. Because hair was not the only language they developed. They also wrote. Thousands upon thousands of letters, preserved in attics and archives, written in language so passionate that modern readers blush. Yet these letters were read by families, passed around, kept openly. How was this possible? What did these women dare to say to each other, and how did they get away with it? The answer reveals just how clever women had to be to express the truth of their hearts. Imagine finding a box of letters in your grandmother's attic. You open one, expecting recipes or gossip about church socials, and instead you read this. My darling, I cannot sleep for thinking of you. The hours until I see you again stretch before me like an eternity. I long to hold you, to feel your breath against my cheek, to lie in your arms and forget the world exists. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. Your first thought might be, Grandma had a secret lover. How scandalous. But then you keep reading and realize both names at the top are women's names. Your second thought might be, wait, were they lovers? Or were they just really, really close friends? Congratulations, you have just encountered the central mystery of Victorian female friendship. And the answer is not simple, because the Victorians themselves deliberately made it complicated. Tonight we are diving into the world of women's letters, the passionate, poetic, sometimes explicitly sensual correspondence that flowed between Victorian women in staggering quantities. These were not hidden documents. They were not locked away or written in code like Anne Lister's diaries. They were kept in boxes, shown to family members, sometimes even published. And yet they contain language that would absolutely be read as romantic, even sexual, by modern standards. So what were these women really saying to each other, and how did they get away with it? Let me start with a specific example, because the details matter. In 1853, a woman named Emily Shaw wrote to her friend Henrietta with these words, "I never loved any human creature as I love you. When I am with you, I am perfectly happy. When I am away from you, I am only half alive. You are my first thought in the morning and my last at night. My attachment to you is the strongest feeling I've ever known." That is not all. She goes on, "I cannot describe the thrill that runs through me when I see you enter a room. The touch of your hand sends electricity through my entire body. I treasure every moment we spend together as the most precious gift life has given me." Now, if you read that in a letter between a man and a woman, you would have zero doubt they were in love. Zero. But this was between two women, and when Emily's mother read it, she smiled and thought how lovely that her daughter had such a devoted friend. This was not unusual. This was normal. Letters like this exist by the thousands in archives and family collections. The language is passionate, devoted, sometimes explicitly physical, and it was all considered perfectly innocent. Why? We have talked about the societal blind spot, the belief that women lacked sexual desire, but there is another factor at work here. The Victorians genuinely believed that women were more emotional, more expressive, more naturally affectionate than men. So when women wrote in language that seemed excessive, that overflowed with sentiment, that declaration of undying devotion, well, that was just how women talked to each other, did not mean anything. Except, of course, sometimes it absolutely did mean something. The brilliant, frustrating thing about these letters is that we often cannot tell which ones were written by women who were sexually involved with each other, and which ones were written by women experiencing intense but non-sexual friendship. The language is the same, the expressions of devotion are identical, and that ambiguity was precisely what made the letters safe to write. Think about it from a strategic standpoint. If you were a woman in love with another woman living in a society that had no category for your experience, how would you communicate your feelings? You could not say I'm a lesbian and I'm in love with you because the language for that barely existed. But you could say, you're my dearest friend, the love of my life, my heart's companion, and everyone would nod approvingly because that is just how female friends talk. The disguise was not even really a disguise. It was more like speaking the truth in a language society could not quite hear. Let me give you another example, this one from literature, because Victorian novels are absolutely full of these relationships. In Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Mary Barton, published in 1848, the title character Mary has an intensely close friendship with a blind girl named Margaret. Listen to how Gaskell describes it. Mary told many of her feelings in a way she had never done before to anyone. Most of her foibles also were made known to Margaret, but not all. That phrase, "but not all," is doing a lot of work. What is Mary hiding from Margaret? The novel tells us she is hiding her feelings for a male love interest. But read it again. Mary shares things with Margaret she has never told anyone. She reveals her deepest self, but there is still something held back, something she cannot share even with her most intimate friend. And the narrator, the omniscient narrator who's supposed to know everything, admits not understanding the depth of their bond. Gaskell writes that she does not know what drew Mary and Margaret together, what made their friendship so deep and so necessary to both of them. It exists, she says, outside of ordinary explanation. That is extraordinary when you think about it. The author creates a relationship so intense, so central to her protagonist's emotional life, that even she as the creator cannot fully explain it. It suggests something beyond the boundaries of what can be openly acknowledged. These kinds of friendships appear again and again in Victorian literature. In George Eliot's Adam Bede, there is a powerful bond between Dinah Morris and Hetty Sorrell. In Charlotte Bronte's Villette, Lucy Snow's feelings for Ginevra Fanshawe are complex and clearly more than simple friendship. In Christina Rossetti's poetry, the beloved addressed is often ambiguously gendered or explicitly female. Were these authors writing about lesbian relationships? Maybe, maybe not. But they were definitely writing about love between women, devotion between women, desire between women, even if that desire was not always physical. And this brings us to a crucial point. We need to be careful not to impose modern categories too rigidly on the past. Not every intense female friendship was a closeted lesbian relationship. The spectrum of emotional and physical intimacy between women in the Victorian era was vast. Some women were what we would now call lesbian or bisexual, and were expressing that through the only acceptable channels available. Other women were experiencing forms of love and devotion that do not fit neatly into modern categories of straight or gay. But all of them, whether they were sexual or not, whether they were what we would call queer or not, were using the same language. And that shared language created a space where truths could be spoken, even if they could not be fully named. Let me share with you one of the most beautiful examples I have found. These are excerpts from a series of letters written between two American women, Rebecca Primus and Addie Brown, in the 1860s. Both women were African American, which adds another layer of complexity and courage to their story. Addie wrote to Rebecca, "My dearest dear, no kisses is like yours." She described longing to lay my head on your bosom and have you stroke my hair as you used to do. She called Rebecca my husband in one letter, a remarkable piece of gender play that suggests they both understood their relationship as more than friendship. Rebecca's letters in response are more reserved, but she clearly reciprocated Addie's feelings. She kept every letter Addie sent. She carried them with her when she travelled. When they were reunited after months apart, Addie wrote about the bliss of sleeping in Rebecca's bed again. These letters were not hidden. Addie's family knew about them. Rebecca's family knew, and they were preserved, kept alive, passed down through generations, because as far as anyone official was concerned, this was just an unusually devoted friendship between two young women. But read those letters now, and tell me they're just about friendship. No kisses is like yours. That is not ambiguous. That is a woman who has kissed another woman and found those kisses distinct, special, better than others. And yet the letters survived precisely because of the ambiguity shield. They could always be read as metaphorical, as exaggerated female sentiment, as innocent affection. Now here is where it gets heartbreaking. Many of these letter collections end abruptly when one of the women gets married. The passionate correspondence just stops. Sometimes there is a final letter saying something like, "I will always treasure our friendship, but I know my husband would not understand our closeness, so I must ask you to destroy my letters." And sometimes they were destroyed. burned in fireplaces, torn into pieces, erased from history. We only have the collections that survived, either because no marriage intervened, or because someone could not bear to destroy them, or because they were hidden away and forgotten until discovered decades later. There is a particular poignancy to the letters that include instructions for destruction. Burn this after reading. Please, I beg you, let no one else see these words. Sometimes the recipient ignored these instructions, thank goodness, and kept the letters anyway, hidden in trunks or sewn into the linings of boxes. Those acts of preservation, the refusal to destroy evidence of love, are themselves a kind of courage. The women who kept letters they were asked to burn were taking a risk. They were saying silently, "This mattered. This was real. I will not erase it." One of the most famous preserved collections belongs to the poet Emily Dickinson. Emily had several intensely passionate friendships with women, most notably with her sister-in-law Susan Gilbert Dickinson. The letters between them are extraordinary. Emily writes to Susan with language that is unmistakably erotic. "Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me as you used to?" She writes about missing Susan's physical presence, about longing for her touch, about feeling complete without her. And Susan kept these letters. Even after she married Emily's brother, even after their relationship became complicated and painful, Susan kept every letter Emily sent her. Those letters were discovered after both women died, and scholars have been arguing about them ever since. Were Emily and Susan lovers? Were they experiencing what the Victorians would call romantic friendship? Does it matter? The letters themselves give us Emily's truth. She loved Susan deeply, passionately, with her whole being. The form that love took, whether it was physical or not, is perhaps less important than the fact that Emily felt free to express it in writing, to send these declarations through the mail, to trust Susan to understand, but not everyone was so fortunate. For every collection of letters that survived, how many were destroyed? How many women burned their beloved's letters the night before their weddings, weeping as the paper turned to ash? How many families found passionate letters after a woman died and decided they were too scandalous to keep, too dangerous to preserve? We will never know how much has been lost, but we can be grateful for what remains. Let me tell you about one more collection, because this one has a twist. In the 1880s, a woman named Catherine Broadley and her niece Edith Cooper began writing poetry together under the pen name Michael Field. They lived together for decades, shared a bed, referred to each other as husband and wife in their private diaries, and they wrote love poetry, beautiful, sensual, explicitly passionate love poetry. Some of it was ostensibly about heterosexual love. Michael Field was assumed to be a man after all, but some of it was clearly about love between women. When their true identities were discovered, there was brief scandal. But then, interestingly, the scandal died down. Because Catherine and Edith were also converts to Catholicism, deeply religious, presented themselves as a united poetic force devoted to art and faith. They fit just well enough into acceptable categories: maiden aunts, artistic eccentrics, devout Catholics, that society allowed them to continue. Their private diaries, discovered after their deaths, reveal that they absolutely understood themselves as married to each other. They performed a private marriage ceremony. They celebrated anniversaries. When Catherine died of cancer in 1914, Edith was devastated. She died just months later, likely of grief combined with her own failing health. Their poetry, their letters, their diaries, all of it survived because they were respected as poets, because their work had value beyond their personal lives. The protective shell of literary reputation kept their love story safe. But what about women who were not poets? women who were not famous, women whose only writing was letters to each other, declarations of love preserved in ordinary boxes in ordinary homes. Those letters are the ones most vulnerable to loss. And that is why every collection that survives, every passionate declaration that makes it to an archive, every "I love you" written in 19th century handwriting feels precious, because we are reading words that were meant to be destroyed. We are witnessing love that was supposed to remain invisible. We are seeing women reaching for each other across the barriers of propriety, convention, expectation, and saying, "Despite everything, this is real. Despite everything, I choose you." The language these women used was the language of their time. The frameworks they had, romantic friendship, devoted companionship, sisterly love, were the frameworks available to them. They worked within those constraints brilliantly, speaking truths that could always be denied, declaring feelings that could always be reinterpreted. And here is the beautiful, painful irony. The same ambiguity that protected them then makes them hard to claim now. We cannot always say with certainty, "This woman was a lesbian," or "These women were in a romantic relationship," because they themselves could not use those words. The language did not exist, the categories were different, but we can say, "These women loved each other." They wrote it down, they saved each other's letters, they created a record of devotion that has survived everything history threw at it. And that record is still growing. Even now, people are finding boxes of Victorian letters in attics, at estate sales, in dusty corners of libraries. Researchers are reading through massive collections, finding the passionate friendships hidden among the everyday correspondence. Families are donating their ancestors' papers to archives where scholars can finally read the truth of these women's hearts. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Each passionate declaration, each longing for reunion, each "I love you more than words can say," gives us more evidence of the rich, complex emotional world Victorian women created with each other. So the next time you hear about Victorian romantic friendship or Boston marriages, or women who lived together as devoted companions, remember the letters, remember the thousands of women who wrote their hearts onto paper, who trusted each other with their deepest truths, who found ways to say "I love you" in a language their world could accept. Their words survived. And in surviving, they tell us something crucial about the human capacity to love in the face of every obstacle, to create intimacy despite every restriction, to speak truth even when it must be whispered. But these private declarations, these letters exchanged between individuals, represent just one way Victorian women built lives together. There was also a much more public, much more structured phenomenon emerging in the late 19th century, one that would eventually get its own name, its own social category, its own place in history. Women were not just writing to each other anymore. They were moving in together, pooling their resources, building households as a unit. An American society watching this happen had to decide what to make of it. What they decided tells us everything about how love learns to hide in plain sight, how commitment finds form even when the world has no name for it. Something fascinating happened in America during the late 1800s. Walk down certain streets in Boston, Cambridge, or any college town, and you would notice something unusual. Households run by two women, not sisters, not a widow and her companion, just two women, often professional women, living together in what looked for all the world like a marriage. They shared a home, they pooled their incomes, they made joint decisions about furniture and finances, they hosted dinner parties as a unit, they took vacations together, they grew old together, and when one died, the other inherited everything just like a widow would. Society had to call this something, and the term they settled on, borrowed from a Henry James novel, was Boston marriage. Here is what makes this phenomenon so remarkable. These were not women hiding in cottages in Wales like Eleanor and Sarah. These were not women writing in code like Anne Lister. These were educated, professional women living openly as couples in major American cities and being largely accepted for it. How did this happen? And why did it eventually end? Let me take you into this world because it represents perhaps the most successful large-scale experiment in female partnership that history has given us. The Boston marriage emerged from a specific set of circumstances that came together in late 19th century America. First, women's colleges were created. Places like Wellesley, Smith, Mount Holyoke, Bryn Mawr. For the first time, significant numbers of women were receiving serious academic educations. They were studying classics, philosophy, science, literature. They were forming intellectual friendships with each other that were based on shared interests and ambitions, not just proximity. Second, a small but growing number of professions began opening to women. You could be a teacher, certainly, that had been acceptable for decades. But now you could also be a college professor, a doctor, a social worker, a librarian, a settlement house director. These careers required years of education and dedication. They also provided an independent income. And here is the crucial third factor. Most institutions had marriage bars. If you were a female professor and you got married, you had to resign. If you were a teacher and you married, you lost your position. The logic was that married women should be home taking care of their husbands and children, not working. But it also meant that any woman who wanted a career had to remain legally single. So imagine you are a young woman graduating from Wellesley College in 1890. You've just spent 4 years immersed in academic life, surrounded by other brilliant women. You've discovered you love teaching or research or social reform work. You're offered a position as a professor at a women's college. The pay is modest but sufficient. You will have independence, respect, intellectual stimulation. But there is a catch. You cannot marry a man and keep this life. Marriage means giving up your career, your independence, your income. It means subordinating yourself to a husband who will legally own everything you earn. It means spending your days managing a household and raising children instead of teaching or writing or pursuing the work you love. Or you could find another woman in the same situation and you could build a life together. This is not a hypothetical. This is exactly what thousands of women did. They looked at the options available to them and made a calculated choice. Partnership with another woman offered everything marriage to a man would provide: companionship, domestic stability, shared resources, emotional intimacy, without the loss of legal rights, career, or independence. And because these were respectable, educated women, because they were contributing to society through their work, because they fit into acceptable categories, new women, professional women, spinster colleagues, society mostly let them do it. Let me introduce you to one of the most famous Boston marriages, because their story shows how this could work in practice. Annie Adams Fields was born in 1834 in Boston. She came from a wealthy family, received an excellent education, and was known for her intelligence and social grace. In 1854, at age 19, she married James Thomas Fields, one of the most important publishers in America. He published Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Harriet Beecher Stowe, basically everyone who mattered in 19th century American literature. Annie became famous as a hostess. Her salon was where literary Boston gathered. She had a genuine talent for spotting promising writers and encouraging them. Her husband regularly published authors Annie recommended, and many of them became major successes. She was brilliant at this work, and by all accounts she loved her husband genuinely. Then in 1881, James Fields died. Annie was 47 years old, wealthy, well-connected, and devastated with grief. She withdrew from society. She stopped hosting her famous gatherings. She could not imagine how to continue without James. Enter Sarah Orne Jewett. Sarah was a writer from Maine, 23 years younger than Annie, just beginning to make her name with beautifully observed stories about New England life. She had been a guest at Annie's salon before James died. When she heard about Annie's grief, she reached out with a letter of condolence. Annie responded. They began corresponding. Sarah visited Boston to comfort her, and something shifted. The friendship that had been cordial and literary became something deeper. Sarah wrote to a friend that she and Annie had discovered they were made for each other. By late 1881, Sarah had essentially moved into Annie's house on Charles Street in Boston. They lived together for the next 28 years, until Sarah's death in 1909. Now, what was the nature of their relationship? Were they lovers in the physical sense? We do not have explicit evidence either way. What we do have is this: they shared a home and a life. They travelled together every year, spending summers in Maine and winters in Boston. They made all major decisions jointly. Sarah's letters refer to their house, their plans, their life together. When they were apart, they wrote to each other daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Sarah addressed Annie as my dear and my darling. Annie called Sarah my other self. Their friends referred to them as a couple. When invitations went out for social events, they went to Mrs. Fields and Jewett as a unit, and Boston society accepted this completely. Why? Because they were respectable widows and spinsters. Because they were contributing to culture. Annie as a patron of the arts, Sarah as an important regional writer. Because they fit the model of companionate friendship that everyone understood. But here is what makes their story particularly significant. Henry James knew them both well. His sister Alice James had her own Boston marriage with a woman named Catherine Loring. And in 1886, Henry published a novel called The Bostonians, about two women, Olive Chancellor and Verena Tarrant, who form an intense partnership that is clearly romantic and possibly sexual. The novel was controversial because it took something everyone politely ignored, the fact that some of these partnerships were more than friendship, and put it on the page. James never used the term Boston marriage himself, but the novel became so associated with these relationships that the term emerged from it. And this is where we see the shift beginning. Before the Bostonians, these partnerships existed in comfortable ambiguity. After it, people started looking more closely, asking more questions, becoming more suspicious. But in the 1880s and 90s, Boston marriages were still widely accepted, even celebrated. Wellesley College had so many faculty members in these partnerships that it became an open secret on campus. Two professors would share a house. They would attend college functions together. They would be treated by colleagues and students as a unit. One of the most respected partnerships at Wellesley was between Catherine Lee Bates and Catherine Coman. Bates is famous now as the author of America the Beautiful. Yes, that song. Coman was an economist and social reformer. They met at Wellesley in 1890, immediately recognized kindred spirits in each other, and spent the next 25 years building a life together. They shared a house they called the Scarab. They traveled the world together, Europe, Egypt, the American West. They were both passionate about social justice and pacifism. They supported each other's work completely. Bates dedicated several of her poetry collections to Coman. They were openly affectionate with each other in ways that their colleagues and students could see. When Coman died of breast cancer in 1915, Bates was shattered. She wrote a beautiful, heartbreaking poem called Yellow Clover that is clearly a love poem to Coman. It speaks of the love that I have lost and describes their years together with language that is unmistakably romantic. The poem was published. It was well received. People read it as a moving tribute to deep friendship, because that is what they chose to see, but read it now with open eyes, and it is a widow's lament for her wife. There is no other way to interpret lines like, "O love, we two together, through golden days and grey, have found the world's rough weather, sweet with the clover hay." That is not friendship, that is marriage. And Bates knew it. Even if she could not say it directly, our Boston marriages were not limited to academics. They appeared across the professional spectrum. To Mary Walker and to Mary Edwards Walker, yes, two doctors with the same name, no relation, lived together for over 30 years in upstate New York. Jane Addams, founder of Hull House and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, had a 40-year partnership with Mary Rosé Smith. They lived together, travelled together, and were universally acknowledged as a couple, though always in the language of devoted friendship. Lillian Wald, who founded the visiting nurse service in New York, lived with her partner Lavinia Dock for decades. They shared everything: work, home, finances, life. Wald's letters to Dock are passionate and devoted. She calls her "my darling" and speaks of missing her physical presence when they are apart. These were not hidden relationships, these were public partnerships between prominent women. And they were largely accepted because the women involved were doing important work. They were serving society. They were respectable. They were not threatening the social order, or at least not in ways that were immediately visible. But there were limits to acceptance, even at the height of the Boston marriage era. The partnerships that survived were ones between women of the same social class, the same race, the same general status. Cross-class or cross-race partnerships faced much more scrutiny and condemnation. And the women involved had to be very careful about how they presented themselves. They could live together, but they should not be too obvious about it. They could be affectionate, but not too physically demonstrative in public. They could share a bed, many did, but they could not talk about sharing a bed. The rules were unspoken but very real. Stay within these boundaries and you could have a life together. Cross them and you risked scandal, ostracism, loss of employment. Most women navigated these boundaries successfully. They built genuine, lasting partnerships that gave them companionship, stability, and love. They created households that were efficient and comfortable. They supported each other's work and ambitions. They grew old together. But then something changed. In the 1920s, the golden age of Boston marriage came to an abrupt end. What happened? Several things converged. First, Freudian psychology became popular, and with it came new ideas about sexuality. The concept of lesbianism as a distinct identity, as a psychological condition, became widespread. Suddenly, two women living together were not just friends or companions. They were suspect, they might be lesbians. And lesbianism in this new framework was pathological. It was something to be treated, cured, avoided. Second, marriage bars started to lift slowly. Women could sometimes keep their jobs after marriage. This made marriage to a man a viable option for professional women in ways it had not been before. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the first wave of feminism achieved some of its goals. Women got the vote in 1920. They had more legal rights. The urgency of creating alternative living arrangements decreased as conventional marriage became less legally oppressive. And fourth, there was a cultural shift toward compulsory heterosexuality. The 1920s were the beginning of modern dating culture, of the expectation that everyone should pair off into heterosexual couples. Women who did not were increasingly seen as failures, or perverts, or both. By 1930, Boston marriages had become scandalous instead of respectable. Women who might have entered such partnerships a generation earlier now felt they had to choose between marriage to a man or solitary spinsterhood. The middle option, a life partnership with another woman, had become too dangerous. Some of the partnerships that had been established earlier continued, of course. Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett's relationship only ended with Sarah's death in 1909. Catherine Lee Bates lived alone after Catherine Coman died in 1915, but she never stopped honouring their partnership. The older generation of Boston marriages lasted as long as the women in them lived. But new ones became rare. Young women coming of age in the 1920s and 30s did not have the same option. The door that had been briefly open had closed. What remains are the records, the houses these women shared, the letters they wrote, the wills that left everything to the surviving partner, the photographs of two women sitting close together, arms around each other, looking at the camera with expressions that are both proud and slightly defiant. And the work. Oh, the work. Because here is what is remarkable about the Boston marriage era. These partnerships freed women to accomplish extraordinary things. Jane Addams could run Hull House and change social work forever because Mary Rose A. Smith managed their household and provided emotional support. Catherine Lee Bates could write poetry and teach because Catherine Coman shared the domestic labour and the finances. Sarah Orne Jewett could focus on her writing because Annie Fields created a stable home for her. These women did not have to choose between love and work, between partnership and ambition. They found a way to have both. For a brief shining moment in history, they had a third option, and they took it. The fact that the option disappeared, that later generations could not access it, is tragic. But the fact that it existed at all, that thousands of women lived rich, full, partnered lives together, that they created a model of egalitarian domestic partnership that was in many ways more progressive than heterosexual marriage of the same era, that matters. Because they proved it was possible. They showed that women could build lives together based on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine partnership. They created households that were intellectual salons, reform centres, artistic studios, homes in the truest sense, and they loved each other. However you want to interpret that love, as romantic friendship, as lesbian relationships, as something in between, they loved each other. They chose each other. They built lives together. Some of them, we know, were sexually involved. Others were not. Most fell somewhere on a spectrum that we still do not have perfect language for. But they all committed to each other in ways that were real, binding and honoured. So when you hear the term Boston marriage, do not think of it as a euphemism or a cover story. Think of it as what it was. A genuine form of partnership, a way of organising life and love that worked for the women involved, a third path between marriage and solitude. And remember that for every famous Boston marriage we know about, Fields and Jewett, Bates and Coman, Addams and Smith, there were hundreds more, schoolteachers sharing a cottage, librarians sharing an apartment, nurses sharing a house, social workers, professors, doctors, all creating lives with each other, partnerships that sustained them through decades. Their lives were not tragic. They were not unfulfilled. They were not settling for second best. They were choosing each other, deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were doing. And for a while, society let them. That brief window of opportunity, that moment when being a professional woman and being partnered with another woman were both socially acceptable, tells us something important. It tells us that when women have economic independence and educational opportunities, they make choices that serve their own needs and desires. Some choose men, some choose women, some choose both at different times, some choose neither. And when we look at the Boston marriage era, we see what happens when one of those choices is actually available and actually respected. We see women thriving. We see partnerships that lasted 40, 50 years. We see work that changed the world. We see love that endured. But we also see something else. Women whose love could exist only as long as it remained carefully undefined, whose partnerships were always one accusation away from scandal, whose lives together could be celebrated only as long as no one looked too closely at what they were celebrating. That tension between visibility and safety, between being seen and being safe, did not disappear when Boston marriages became scandalous. It shifted, transformed, appeared in new forms. Because while American professional women were building their careful partnerships, as something very different was happening on the stages of New York and London. Actresses were living their truths much more loudly, much more visibly, and somehow getting away with it. Their story is wilder, messier, and absolutely fascinating. The theatre has always been a strange space, a place where the normal rules bend and sometimes break entirely. Where else could the woman dress as a man and be celebrated for it? Where else could passion be performed nightly to thunderous applause? Where else could someone live a life on stage that would be absolutely scandalous off it? And somehow the scandal transforms into stardom. In the mid-1800s, the most famous Shakespearean actor in America was not a man. It was a woman named Charlotte Cushman. And she did not play Juliet or Ophelia or any of the delicate heroines you might expect. She played Romeo, she played Hamlet, she played Cardinal Wolsey in Henry VIII. She strode across stages in doublet and hose, her voice powerful and commanding, her presence so magnetic that audiences forgot they were watching a woman at all. Off stage, Charlotte lived just as boldly. She had passionate public relationships with women. She travelled Europe with her lovers. She set up households with them. She introduced them to society as her companions, her dearest friends, her everything. And somehow she remained the most respected actress of her generation. How? How did Charlotte Cushman get away with living so openly as a woman who loved women, when others had to hide and whisper and pretend? The answer tells us something fascinating about performance, celebrity, and the strange protections that fame can offer. Charlotte was born in 1816 in Boston to a family that fell on hard times when she was young. Her father's business failed, and Charlotte, the eldest daughter, knew she needed to help support her family. She had a powerful singing voice, so she tried opera first. But her voice gave out during a performance, permanently damaged, and she had to find another path. She turned to acting, and she discovered she was brilliant at it. But here is the thing about Charlotte. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with strong features and a commanding presence. She could not play the ingenue, the delicate maiden. So she did something radical. She started playing men. Her Romeo was a revelation. Critics raved that she brought genuine passion to the role, that her love scenes with the actress playing Juliet were more convincing than when 2 men played the roles. Because yes, in those days all roles were played by men in many theatres. Charlotte made Romeo young, ardent, believable. Women in the audience reportedly fainted during the balcony scene. Think about what is happening there. Hundreds of people watching a woman dressed as a man declaring passionate love to a woman dressed as a woman. And instead of being scandalized, they are moved to tears. They are fainting. They are declaring it the greatest Romeo they have ever seen. The stage gave Charlotte permission to do things that would be unthinkable in ordinary life. She could wear men's clothing. She could be physically intimate with other women, the staged kisses, the embraces, the passionate declarations. She could embody masculine power and authority. And it was all acceptable because it was performance. Except Charlotte did not entirely leave it on the stage. In 1844, Charlotte met an actress named Matilda Hayes in London. Matilda was younger, beautiful, and immediately captivated by Charlotte's intensity. They began what was, by any measure, a romance. They were inseparable, they travelled together, they lived together. Charlotte introduced Matilda as her companion, but the way she looked at her, the way she spoke about her, left little doubt about the depth of her feelings. and London society gossiped, certainly. But Charlotte was famous, she was successful, she was making enormous amounts of money and was friends with the most important people in theatre and literature. So society talked, but it also tolerated. Charlotte and Matilda eventually moved to Rome, joining a community of expatriate women artists that would become known as the White Marmorian Flock, a somewhat mocking nickname referring to the number of female sculptors working in white marble. This community included Harriet Hosmer, a brilliant American sculptor who also never married and lived openly with the female companions. It included Emma Stebbins, another sculptor who would eventually become Charlotte's partner after her relationship with Matilda ended. Rome in the 1850s was apparently a place where artistic women could live with unusual freedom. They worked, they socialized, they formed relationships with each other, and the expatriate community largely accepted it. Charlotte was at the center of this world, hosting gatherings, supporting younger artists, living openly with her companions. The writer Henry Wadsworth Longfellow knew Charlotte well. He visited her in Rome, saw her life with Matilda, and in 1849 he published a novella called Kavanagh that includes one of the first lesbian relationships in American fiction between two characters named Cecilia and Alice. Scholars generally agree that Longfellow based this relationship on Charlotte and Matilda. Here is what is extraordinary about that. Longfellow was not condemning them, he was not exposing a scandal, he was writing their relationship into fiction with sympathy and understanding. The novel treats the love between Cecilia and Alice as genuine, as worthy of the same respect as heterosexual love, even though Cecilia ultimately marries a man. This suggests that at least some people in Charlotte's social circle understood exactly what she was doing, and they were okay with it. More than okay, they were supportive enough to write about it. But Charlotte's relationship with Matilda did not last. They had a painful breakup in the mid-1850s. The details are lost, but it clearly hurt Charlotte deeply. She turned to her work, continuing to perform to sold-out crowds, continuing to play male roles with extraordinary power. And then she met Emma Stebbins. Emma was a sculptor from New York, part of that same Roman artistic community. She was talented, serious about her work, and utterly devoted to Charlotte. They became partners around 1857, and this relationship would last for the rest of Charlotte's life. Charlotte and Emma were remarkably open about their partnership. They lived together in Rome, then in New York. When Charlotte retired from the stage in 1874, Emma cared for her. When Charlotte died of pneumonia in 1876, Emma was devastated. She spent the next 2 years writing Charlotte's biography, a book that celebrated their relationship while carefully using the language of devoted friendship. The biography is fascinating because Emma clearly wants to tell the truth of their love while staying within acceptable boundaries. She describes their meeting, their instant connection, their decision to make a life together. She quotes from Charlotte's letters, passionate, devoted letters that use language almost identical to what we saw in women's correspondence earlier. But she frames it all as the deepest of friendships, the most perfect of companionships. Was Emma protecting Charlotte's reputation? Or was she using the only language available to her? Probably both. She knew their love was real. She knew it mattered. She wanted it recorded. But she also knew that being too explicit would invite scandal, would diminish Charlotte's legacy, would turn their beautiful partnership into something sordid in the public eye. So she wrote carefully, and the book was well received. Charlotte was memorialized as a great actress, a devoted friend, a woman of passion and principle. The fact that she had lived with female companions her entire adult life was noted, certainly, but it was presented as the choice of a woman too dedicated to her art to bother with conventional marriage. Now, here is the question we have to ask. Did Charlotte's fame protect her? Or did her talent make people willing to overlook what they found uncomfortable? I think it is both. Charlotte was so good at what she did that people wanted to celebrate her. They wanted to claim her as a source of national pride. She was proof that Americans could produce art that rivaled anything in Europe. So when confronted with aspects of her life that might be scandalous, they chose to look away, or to reinterpret, or to justify. The theatre helped too. Because Charlotte made her living performing gender, performing passion, performing love between herself and other women, her offstage life could be read as an extension of that performance. Maybe she was just so committed to her craft that she stayed in character even when the curtain fell. Maybe all that intensity was just artistic temperament. Of course, that is not what was happening. Charlotte was not performing her love for women. She was living it. But the theatre gave her cover, gave her plausible deniability, gave her a framework that let society accept what it might otherwise condemn. And Charlotte used that framework brilliantly. She dressed in a way that was masculine but could be called practical for travel. She lived with companions but called them friends. She was passionate but channeled that passion through her art. She stayed just inside the lines, or at least close enough that people could pretend she did. This strategy worked for Charlotte because she had several things going for her. She was famous, which gave her power. She was financially successful, which gave her independence. She was white and from a respectable family background, which gave her social status. And she was an artist, which meant she could be eccentric, unconventional, dramatic, and have it read as genius rather than deviance. But what about women who did not have those advantages? What about women who were not famous actresses? What about women who could not hide behind the excuse of artistic temperament? For them, the protections Charlotte enjoyed were not available. An ordinary woman living openly with a female companion, introducing her as the love of her life, would face much harsher consequences. Charlotte's celebrity was crucial to her freedom, and yet even with that celebrity, even with all those protections, Charlotte still had to be careful. She still used the language of friendship in public. She still introduced her lovers as companions. She still let people believe what they wanted to believe. There is something both inspiring and heartbreaking about that. Inspiring because Charlotte found a way to live authentically within the constraints of her era. Heartbreaking because even with her fame and success, she could not simply say, "This is my wife, this is my beloved, this is who I am." The closest she came was in her art. When she played Romeo, she was declaring her love to Juliet in front of hundreds of people. When she played Hamlet, she was embodying masculine power and authority. When she performed passionate scenes with other actresses, she was showing the world what she felt. The stage let her be truthful in ways ordinary life did not, and audiences loved her for it, even if they did not fully understand what they were watching. After Charlotte died in 1876, her obituaries praised her as the greatest actress America had produced. They mentioned her devotion to her friends, her support of other artists, her powerful performances. Some noted that she had never married, but framed it as a sacrifice for her art. Emma Stebbins lived another 26 years, carrying Charlotte's memory, protecting her legacy, presumably missing her every single day. When Emma died in 1902, she was buried in New York, not next to Charlotte. Charlotte was in Boston. Even in death, they could not fully claim each other, in the way Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby had been buried together. But Emma had written the biography. She had ensured Charlotte's story would survive. And in that biography, if you read carefully, if you understand the code, you can see the truth. Two women who loved each other, who built a life together, who supported each other's work and dreams. Charlotte's story shows us one path to freedom, the path of celebrity, of performance, of using talent and fame as a shield. It worked for her. She had a life filled with love, art, passion, and recognition. She died knowing she had been successful, that her work mattered, that she had lived on her own terms as much as any woman of her era could. But it is not a path available to everyone. Most women were not famous actresses. Most women did not have the option of performing their truth on stage every night. Most women had to find other ways to navigate the contradiction between who they were and who society demanded they be. And this brings us to another fascinating question. Because while Charlotte was performing Shakespeare and living openly with her companions, while Boston marriages were flourishing in academic communities, something else was happening in the world of literature. Victorian novelists were writing women's relationships into their fiction, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, and those novels were being read by millions of women who saw their own feelings reflected on the page, often for the first time. What happens when women see themselves in fiction? What happens when the feelings they have been told are impossible, unseemable, wrong? When those feelings show up in respectable novels written by respectable authors, published by respectable publishers, what happens is that women start to understand they are not alone. They start to recognize themselves in characters who love other women, who choose other women, who build lives with other women. They start to imagine possibilities. And that recognition, that imagination, becomes dangerous to the social order in ways that even the most scandalous actress living openly with her companion never was. Because one woman's unconventional life can be dismissed as an aberration, as artistic temperament, as individual eccentricity. But when stories start circulating, when novels start depicting these relationships as normal and even beautiful, when women across the country are reading the same books and recognizing the same truths, that is when the paradigm starts to shift. The Victorian novel became a battleground, a place where women's love for each other could be depicted, explored, celebrated, and also controlled. Authors had to be clever, had to write in code just like women writing letters. They had to embed their truths in plots that seemed to affirm conventional marriage while actually telling a different story entirely. And they did. Oh, they absolutely did. The novels are there waiting to be read with understanding eyes. The love stories are there, hidden in plain sight just like everything else we have talked about. And when you start to see them, when you start to recognize the patterns, you realize just how much Victorian literature was actually about women loving women. It just never said so directly. Let me show you what I mean. Let me take you into the pages of these novels and reveal the hidden architecture of desire, the careful construction of plausible deniability, the ways that women writers smuggled truth past the censors and into the hearts of their readers. Every Victorian novel seems to end the same way, does it not? The heroine, after trials and tribulations, marries the hero. The wedding bells ring, the book closes, happily ever after. Except, what if I told you that in many of these novels, the real love story is not between the heroine and the man she marries? What if the deepest emotional connection, the most passionate relationship, the bond that actually drives the plot, what if all of that is between two women? And the marriage at the end is just something that has to happen because, well, that is how Victorian novels are supposed to end. Once you start looking for this pattern, you cannot unsee it. It is everywhere. The structure is remarkably consistent. Two women meet. They form an intense bond. They share secrets, dreams, intimate moments. They are more important to each other than anyone else in the story. And then, at the last moment, one of them marries a man who has been hovering in the background the whole time, barely developed as a character, serving mainly as the plot device that allows the novel to have an acceptable ending. The marriage plot, the expectation that novels must end with heterosexual marriage, actually became a brilliant hiding place for stories about women loving women. Because if you promise to deliver that ending, you can spend the entire middle of the book writing whatever you want. And what many Victorian women writers wanted to write about was the emotional and sometimes erotic bonds between women. Let me show you exactly how this worked. Elizabeth Gaskell published Mary Barton in 1848. It is ostensibly a social novel about working-class life in Manchester, about labour disputes and poverty and crime. The plot centres on Mary Barton, a young factory worker, and her eventual marriage to Jem Wilson, a workman who loves her. But the emotional heart of the novel, that is the relationship between Mary and her friend Margaret Jennings, a blind girl who supports herself by singing. Gaskell writes that Mary shares things with Margaret that she has never told anyone else. Their friendship has what the narrator describes as a quality of muted, impenetrable intimacy that even the omniscient narrator cannot fully explain or access. Think about that. The narrator, who is supposed to know everything, admits not understanding the depth of connection between Mary and Margaret. And here is the crucial part. Mary lies to Margaret. She keeps secrets from her. But she also reveals her deepest self to her in ways she never does with Jem, her supposed true love. The novel explicitly states that Mary's attachment to Margaret is the strongest feeling she has ever known, stronger than her love for Jem. The text says this, out loud, but Jem is a man, and this is a Victorian novel, so Mary marries him. The relationship with Margaret does not end, in fact it continues, but it gets subordinated to the marriage plot. The novel has to end with Mary as a wife because that is the only acceptable ending. But the relationship that actually matters, the one the author spends the most time developing, the one with the most emotional depth, that is between two women. Or take George Eliot's Adam Bede, published in 1859. The plot involves a love triangle between Adam Bede, Hetty Sorrel, and Arthur Donnithorne. But the most compelling relationship in the entire novel is between Dinah Morris, a Methodist preacher, and Hetty, the beautiful but shallow girl who gets seduced and abandoned. Dinah's feelings for Hetty are intense, passionate, almost obsessive. She pursues Hetty. She tries to save her soul. She visits her in prison after Hetty is arrested for infanticide. The scenes between them crackle with an energy that the supposedly romantic relationships in the novel never achieve. And at the end, Dinah marries Adam. It feels tacked on, almost like an afterthought. Many critics have noted that the marriage seems unmotivated, that Dinah and Adam barely interact for most of the novel. But it has to happen because Dinah is the heroine and heroines must marry. What is fascinating is that Victorian readers apparently did not notice this pattern. Or if they did not comment on it. They read these novels as being about the marriage plot, about the journey toward heterosexual union, even though the actual emotional content of the books tells a different story. Modern scholars have noticed, though, there is a whole field of queer reading of Victorian literature that examines exactly this phenomenon. The way that women's relationships are depicted as more emotionally satisfying, more intimate, more central to the characters' lives than their relationships with men, even in novels that ostensibly celebrate heterosexual marriage. Charlotte Brontë does this too, perhaps most obviously in Villette, published in 1853. The novel's protagonist, Lucy Snow, has complicated feelings for several people, including a man named Paul Emanuel who dies before they can marry, which is itself interesting, right? Brontë does not even give Lucy the conventional happy ending, but Lucy's most intense relationships are with women. Ginevra Fanshawe, a flirtatious student, captures Lucy's attention in ways that seem to go beyond disapproval or fascination. Lucy watches Ginevra constantly. She describes her appearance in loving detail. She is preoccupied with Ginevra's relationships with men in a way that reads as jealousy. And then there is Madame Beck, the school's headmistress, who watches Lucy with equal intensity. The novel is full of watching, of women looking at each other, of gazes that linger just a bit too long. Bronte was clearly writing about desire between women, even if she could not or chose not to name it explicitly. And she could do this because the novel's structure, its engagement with the marriage plot, gave her cover. As long as Lucy is pursuing or being pursued by men, as long as the possibility of heterosexual marriage exists, Bronte can write whatever she wants about Lucy's feelings for women. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. These novels were being read by thousands of women across Britain and America. Middle-class women, working-class women who saved up to buy cheap editions, women in book clubs and lending libraries, and these women were seeing themselves in these stories. Imagine you are a young woman in 1860 reading Adam Bede. You have a close friend, a woman you love more than anyone else in the world. But you have been told that this is just friendship, that your real future lies in marriage to a man. Then you read about Dinah and Hetty, about the intensity of their connection, and you think, oh, other people feel this too, this is real. I am not alone. The novels validated experiences that society said did not exist. They gave women a language, a framework, a way of understanding their own feelings. Even if the novels ultimately affirmed heterosexual marriage, even if they forced their heroines to marry men, they spent hundreds of pages depicting women's love for each other as deep, real, and worthy of attention. And this is where authors had to be so careful. They had to write in a way that could be read as innocent by those who wanted to see innocence, but that could also be read as romantic or even sexual by those who were looking for it. Take Christina Rossetti's poem Goblin Market, published in 1862. On the surface, it is a fairy tale about two sisters, Laura and Lizzie, and their encounter with goblin merchants selling forbidden fruit. Laura eats the fruit and begins to waste away. Lizzie saves her by going to the goblins, resisting their fruit and bringing back the juice on her own body for Laura to lick off. Yes, you read that correctly. Lizzie comes home covered in fruit juice and tells Laura to hug me, kiss me, suck my juices. Those are the actual words in the poem. For over a century, critics read this as a Christian allegory about temptation and redemption. And sure, it can be read that way, but it can also be read as an intensely erotic poem about one woman saving another through physical intimacy, through the offering of her own body. The ambiguity was the point. Rossetti could publish this poem, it could be taught to children, it could be considered a wholesome moral tale, and yet it could also speak to readers who understood it differently, who read the eroticism, who saw the love between women. This dual reading was possible because Victorian society was so invested in seeing women as pure, as non-sexual, that they could not imagine the erotic implications of women's intimacy with each other. The blind spot protected the authors. They could write desire as long as they also provided the innocent interpretation, and they absolutely did write desire. Listen to how George Eliot describes Dorothea looking at Celia in Middlemarch. She felt a new sisterly relation, something like the maternal guardianship which was expected of her. That sounds innocent enough, right? Sisterly, maternal, safe. But then look at how much time Dorothea spends thinking about Celia, looking at her, being aware of her physical presence. Look at how the narrative dwells on women's appearances, on their movements, on the way they dress and carry themselves. There is a gaze there, an attention to women's bodies that exceeds what is strictly necessary for the plot. Modern feminist critics have written extensively about the female gaze in Victorian literature, the way that women writers looked at women characters with an intensity and specificity that suggests more than clinical observation. They argue that this gaze is itself a form of desire, even when it is not explicitly sexual. And here is something fascinating. Male critics at the time sometimes complained about this. They said women writers spent too much time on female friendships, that they were too interested in the minutiae of women's relationships with each other. that they neglected the romantic plot in favour of depicting female community. They were right. Women writers were more interested in writing about women's relationships with each other, because those were the relationships they knew, the ones they valued, the ones that actually shaped their lives. The marriage plot was something they had to include, but what they wanted to write about was the world of women. George Eliot herself never married conventionally. She lived with George Henry Lewis in what was essentially a common law marriage, which was scandalous enough. But she also had intensely close friendships with women throughout her life. She understood the emotional landscape she was depicting because she lived in it. The same is true for Charlotte and Emily Bronte, for Elizabeth Gaskell, for most of the major women novelists of the era. They were part of networks of women who supported each other, wrote to each other, loved each other, and they wrote what they knew. But they had to hide it in plain sight. They had to embed it in plots that affirmed conventional marriage. They had to use language that could be read as innocent. They had to give readers plausible deniability, and it worked. For over 100 years, these novels were read as being about the marriage plot, about women's proper destiny as wives and mothers. The relationships between women were seen as preparation for marriage, as practice for the real thing. Only in the late 20th century did scholars start reading these novels differently, start recognizing the pattern, start asking, wait, what if these relationships between women are not subordinate to the marriage plot? What if they are the actual centre of these novels, and the marriages are just window dressing? Once you start asking that question, the entire Victorian literary canon looks different. Novel after novel reveals the same structure. Women at the centre, women's relationships as the emotional core, marriage as the ending that has to happen, but that often feels unsatisfying or unmotivated. It is subversive storytelling disguised as conventional narrative. It is women writers claiming space to write about women's love for each other, while pretending to write about something else entirely. And thousands of women readers understood. They read these novels and saw themselves. They read about Dinah and Hetty, about Mary and Margaret, about Laura and Lizzie, and there they recognized their own feelings, their own relationships, their own truths. The novels could not change society. They could not make it acceptable for women to choose each other over marriage, but they could validate women's experiences. They could say, this is real, this matters, you are not alone. And for many women that was enough. It had to be enough, because open acknowledgement was impossible. But these covert acknowledgements, these hidden representations, these stories that could be read two ways, those were available. Those were safe, so women read and wrote and passed books to each other and understood what was really being said beneath the surface. They created a literary culture that spoke to them in code, that told their truths while pretending to tell conventional stories. But reading about these relationships in novels, however validating, was not the same as living them, and living them meant navigating the constant threat of loss. The knowledge that these bonds could be broken at any moment by the demands of marriage, family, propriety. It meant loving with the understanding that your love would always be secondary, always subordinate, always in danger. What happened when these relationships ended? What did it feel like when your dearest friend, your beloved, the person you had chosen and who had chosen you, what happened when she married someone else? When the marriage plot that protected you in fiction became the force that destroyed you in reality? That pain, that loss, that betrayal, it is the dark side of everything we've been discussing. And it is where we need to go next, into the heartbreak that the romantic friendship model almost inevitably produced. There is a letter in the archives at Smith College that will break your heart if you read it with understanding eyes. It was written in 1863 by a woman named Lucy to her friend Emma, who had just announced her engagement. "I congratulate you on your approaching happiness," Lucy writes. her handwriting shaky. "I know you will be very content as a wife. I am certain Mr. Harrison is a good man who will make you happy." Then a few lines later the mask slips. "I do not know how I shall bear it when you leave. You've been everything to me, my dearest friend, my confidant, my whole world. I cannot imagine my days without you in them, but I know this is what you must do. This is what all of us must do eventually." And then, at the very end, in writing so small you can barely read it, "Please burn this letter after reading. I should not have written so freely, forgive me." Emma did not burn the letter. She kept it, hidden in a box with all of Lucy's other letters. And when she died 40 years later, her daughter found them and donated them to the college archive, never knowing what story they really told. This is the part of our story we have been avoiding. The heartbreak, the endings, the moment when the protective framework of romantic friendship collided with the inexorable demands of heterosexual marriage, and women's hearts shattered in the collision. Because here is the brutal truth. For all the freedom that romantic friendships offered, for all the ways women found to love each other openly, there was always an expiration date. Marriage to a man was not optional for most Victorian women. It was economic necessity, social imperative, family obligation, and when it came, it severed bonds that were supposed to be eternal. Let me tell you what this looked like in practice, because the details matter. Two young women, let us call them Catherine and Jane, meet in their late teens. Perhaps they are neighbours, or they meet at church, or their families are friends. They bond immediately. They start spending all their time together. They write each other passionate letters when apart. They exchange locks of hair. They make promises. "I will love you forever. Nothing will ever come between us. You are my heart's dearest companion." And they mean it. They absolutely mean it. Their families smile approvingly. How lovely that the girls are such good friends. How sweet that they are so devoted to each other. This is exactly what young women are supposed to do. Form these intense emotional bonds that prepare them for the tender feelings they will one day have for their husbands. Except Catherine and Jane are not preparing for anything. They are experiencing the real thing. This is their great love, whether it is sexual or not, and sometimes it is not. It is the central relationship of their lives. Then Jane's father announces she is to marry Mr. Thompson, a respectable man of good family and adequate income. The match has been arranged. The wedding will be in 6 months. What can Jane do? Refuse? On what grounds? She cannot say, "I'm in love with Catherine." That language does not exist. She cannot say, "I have already chosen a partner." Society does not recognize that choice. She cannot even say, "I want to remain independent." Women do not have that option unless they have significant wealth of their own, which most do not. So Jane agrees. What choice does she have? And Catherine? Catherine has to smile and congratulate her friend, has to help her prepare for the wedding, has to attend as a bridesmaid, standing beside the woman she loves while that woman promises to love, honour and obey a man. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine standing there, watching your beloved make vows to someone else, knowing those vows will supersede everything you shared, and having to act like you are happy about it? After the wedding, things change immediately. Jane now belongs to her husband. Legally, actually belongs to him. He owns her property, controls her income, determines where she lives and whom she sees. If Mr. Thompson decides Catherine is an inappropriate influence or that Jane spends too much time with her, he can simply forbid the friendship. And many men did exactly that. There are letters from the 1860s and 70s where newly married women write to their former intimate friends saying essentially, "My husband does not understand our closeness. He says it is unseemly for a married woman to be so devoted to a female friend. He has asked me not to write to you anymore. Please understand, Skim. Please understand, as if understanding makes it hurt less. Sometimes the separation was not because the husband forbade it, but because the wife chose it, because she knew on some level that continuing the friendship would reveal too much about what it really was, that the passionate letters, the longing, the devotion, those things did not fit into her new life as a respectable married woman. So she cut ties, stopped writing, made excuses when her former friend tried to visit. Let the relationship die slowly, quietly, supposedly naturally. And the woman left behind? She had to accept it. She had to watch her beloved disappear into marriage, into motherhood, into a life that had no room for what they had shared. And she had to pretend it was fine, that she was happy for her friend, that this was just the natural course of things. The pain of this must have been extraordinary, but it could not be acknowledged. You could not mourn the loss of a friendship the way you could mourn a death or even a broken engagement. There was no social script for this grief. You were supposed to be happy that your friend had achieved her proper destiny. So women grieved in private. They kept the letters, read them late at night, cried alone. They wore the hair jewellery and wondered if their former beloved ever thought of them. They wrote sad entries in their diaries about feeling lonely, incomplete, abandoned, but always in careful language that did not reveal too much. Now let us go back to Anne Lister, because her story perfectly illustrates this dynamic. Anne's great love was Mariana Belcombe. They met when Anne was young, and the connection was immediate and intense. They were lovers. Anne's diary makes this completely clear. They made promises to each other, planned a future together. But Mariana's family arranged her marriage to Charles Lawton, a wealthy widower. Mariana could have refused. She had some independence, some choices, but the security of marriage, the social respectability, the financial stability, she chose those over Anne. Anne's diary from this period is agonizing to read. She records her pain, her rage, her sense of betrayal. She writes about attending Mariana's wedding and having to act cheerful while her heart was breaking. She describes Mariana's wedding night in bitter detail, imagining what was happening between Mariana and Charles. And then, adding insult to injury, Mariana wanted to continue the affair after marriage. She wanted both, the respectability and security of marriage to Charles, and the passion and intimacy of her relationship with Anne. For a while, Anne accepted this. She was the secret lover, the one Mariana truly loved, while Charles was the public husband. Anne even records in her diary planning for Charles to die young so she could move in with Mariana as a companion, caring for her grieving friend. But Charles did not die young, and over the years, Anne came to understand that Mariana would never choose her fully, would never give up the protection of marriage. The realization was devastating, but it also freed Anne to pursue what she really wanted, a partner who would commit to her completely. That is when she pursued Anne Walker so determinedly. Anne had money. Anne had no family controlling her. Anne could choose, and she chose Anne. But not every woman had Anne Lister's determination, resources, or clarity about what she wanted. Most women just lost their beloved to marriage and had to live with the loss. And here is something that makes it even worse. Sometimes these women were pressured to marry as well, and they did, and then there were two marriages trying to contain what had been one love. The two women might continue to see each other at social events, to exchange polite conversation, to act as though nothing had ever been between them. Can you imagine that particular torture? To see the person you loved, to remember everything you shared, and to have to act like casual acquaintances while your husbands discuss business or politics. Some women found ways around this. There are cases of women whose husbands became friends, which allowed the wives to see each other regularly. There are letters that show women coordinating visits, arranging to vacation at the same locations, finding excuses to spend time together within the bounds of social propriety. But it was never the same. The spontaneity was gone, the freedom was gone, the sense of belonging to each other was gone, replaced by belonging to husbands, to children, to households that demanded their primary loyalty. Not all marriages destroyed these friendships, of course. Some husbands were secure enough, understanding enough, or indifferent enough to allow their wives to maintain close friendships with women. Some women managed to navigate both relationships successfully, giving their husbands what was legally and socially required while preserving emotional intimacy with their female friends. But it required constant negotiation, constant care, constant awareness of boundaries. The ease of the earlier friendship, when they could write whatever they wanted and see each other whenever they chose, that was over. And then there were the women who never married, who were left behind when their friends did. They had their own particular pain, the loneliness of watching everyone around them pair off and disappear into domesticity, the social stigma of spinsterhood, the financial insecurity of trying to survive without a husband's income, the knowledge that their great love had chosen someone else, had chosen security over them. These women sometimes formed new friendships, new intense bonds with other unmarried women. Sometimes they lived together in what would later be called Boston marriages, but often they carried the loss of that first great love their entire lives. There is a particularly heartbreaking pattern in women's diaries from this era. Women in their 50s or 60s, long married with grown children, writing about a friend from their youth. I wonder what became of Elizabeth. I think of her still, though it has been 30 years since I last saw her. She was the dearest friend I ever had. 30 years. And still thinking about her, still remembering, still carrying that love, even though life had taken them in completely different directions. This is the dark underside of everything we have been celebrating. Yes, Victorian society created space for women to love each other. Yes, romantic friendship was real and valuable and beautiful, but it was also fragile, temporary, always vulnerable to the demands of patriarchal marriage, and women knew this. They went into these friendships knowing they might not last. They loved anyway, as deeply and truly as they could, for as long as they were allowed. But the shadow of eventual separation hung over everything. Some historians argue that this made the friendships even more intense. The knowledge that time was limited, that marriage could end everything, maybe that made women treasure what they had even more fiercely while they had it. Maybe that is why the letters are so passionate, the promises so extravagant, the devotion so absolute. They were trying to compress a lifetime of love into the few years before marriage claimed one or both of them. Or maybe that is just a way of making the tragedy bearable, of finding meaning in the loss. Maybe it was just painful and women did it anyway because they had no choice, because loving each other was worth the eventual heartbreak. Either way, the separations happened. Over and over, throughout the Victorian era, women loved each other and then lost each other to marriage. And they had to act like it was fine, like it was natural, like their hearts were not breaking. The ones who refused to accept this pattern, who fought against it, who tried to create alternatives, like Eleanor and Sarah running away to Wales, like Anne Lister engineering her own marriage to Anne Walker, like the women who formed Boston marriages, they were the exceptions. The majority accepted the inevitable. They loved, they lost, they moved on as best they could. But the love had been real, the promises had been real, the sense of belonging to each other had been real, and the loss was real too, even if no one was allowed to acknowledge it. That loss, that grief, that impossible position of loving someone you could not keep, it left traces in the historical record. In letters kept despite instructions to burn them, in diary entries carefully coded, in poems about lost loves that could be read as being about death, but that might be about something else entirely. Christina Rossetti never married. She wrote love poetry her entire life, passionate, longing, often despairing love poetry. Who was she writing about? We do not know for certain. But the intensity of the longing, the sense of love that cannot be fulfilled, the grief over lost connection, it echoes what we see in these broken friendships. What must it have felt like to live through this? To know that the person you loved most in the world was forbidden to you, not by law exactly, but by social expectation so strong it might as well be law. To know that you came second, would always come second, to the institution of marriage. It must have been unbearable, and yet women bore it, because what choice did they have? But here is the thing. As painful as these separations were, as much damage as they did, they also planted seeds of resistance. Because women who experienced this, who lived through the grief of losing their beloved to marriage, some of them started to question the system that demanded this sacrifice. If female friendship was so valuable, so deep, so meaningful, why did it have to be subordinated to marriage? Why could marriage not accommodate it? Why did women have to choose at all? These questions did not have answers in the Victorian era, but they were being asked, and they would eventually contribute to larger questions about marriage, about women's rights, about the structure of society itself. The women who suffered these losses, who grieved these broken bonds, who carried the memory of their lost loves, they were not just victims of a cruel system, they were also, whether they knew it or not, witnesses to the insufficiency of that system, living proof that the official story about women's lives, about heterosexual marriage as the only form of love that mattered, was incomplete at best and deeply damaging at worst. But individual resistance was not enough. Personal grief did not change social structures. What would eventually start to crack the facade, what would make society finally acknowledge what it had been determinedly ignoring, was when doctors and scientists started paying attention. When the medical establishment looked at romantic friendships and Boston marriages and relationships between women and decided to pathologize them, to make them diseases to be cured. That transformation from socially acceptable to medically concerning happened remarkably quickly at the end of the 19th century, and it changed everything. The safe space that women had created for loving each other suddenly became dangerous. The language shifted, the rules changed, and women found themselves categorized, diagnosed, treated as sick for feelings that had been perfectly acceptable just a generation before. That shift, that medicalization, that invention of the lesbian as a pathological type, it is one of the most important turning points in this entire story, and it is where we need to go next, into the moment when loving women became not just unconventional but diseased. Something changed in the 1880s, suddenly, quietly, but definitively. Women who had been living together in respected partnerships found themselves being whispered about in new ways. Romantic friendships that had been celebrated as the pinnacle of female virtue were now being scrutinized with suspicion. The language shifted. What had been devoted companions became abnormal attachments. What had been passionate friends became inverts. The doctors had arrived, and they had decided that love between women was a medical condition. This transformation happened remarkably fast. In 1870, two women living together in a Boston marriage were respectable professional women making a sensible arrangement. By 1900, those same two women might be diagnosed with sexual inversion, prescribed treatments, warned they were damaging their health and morals. The protective framework that had allowed women to love each other for decades crumbled in the space of a generation. What happened? How did acceptable friendship become pathological disease in just 30 years? The answer lies in the rise of a new field called sexology, the scientific study of human sexuality. And the men who founded this field, well-meaning though some of them may have been, fundamentally changed how society understood relationships between women. Let me introduce you to the key players, because their names and their work shaped the next century of LGBTQ history. First, there was Richard von Krafft-Ebing, an Austrian psychiatrist. In 1886, he published a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which translates roughly to sexual psychopathy, or diseases of sexual nature. The book was meant to be a medical textbook cataloguing various sexual behaviors that Krafft-Ebing considered deviant. It included case studies of what he called contrary sexual feeling in women who were attracted to other women instead of to men. He described these women as suffering from a congenital abnormality, a kind of inborn defect that caused them to have masculine traits and desires. Now, here is what is crucial to understand. Krafft-Ebing was not necessarily trying to be cruel. In the context of his time, medicalizing same-sex desire was actually somewhat progressive. He was arguing that these women were not morally corrupt or sinful. They were sick. They could not help it. They deserved medical treatment, not moral condemnation. But the effect was devastating, because now, for the first time, there was a name for women who loved women that was distinct from friendship. The female invert. The woman whose sexual instinct was reversed, who desired women instead of men. And crucially, this was presented as something abnormal, something wrong with the individual woman, something to be identified and treated. Then came Havelock Ellis, a British sexologist who published Sexual Inversion in 1897. Ellis was more sympathetic than Krafft-Ebing. He actually argued that sexual inversion was not necessarily harmful, and that inverts should not be criminally prosecuted. He interviewed numerous women who loved women, and presented their stories with respect. But he still categorized them as a distinct type, as women who were fundamentally different from normal women. He created characteristics of the invert. She was often masculine in appearance, she was athletic, she was intellectual. She had strong friendships with other women from a young age. She showed little interest in men. Do you see what happened there? Ellis took traits that many women had, being athletic, being intellectual, having close female friends, and turned them into symptoms of a medical condition. Suddenly, a woman who preferred her female friends to potential suitors was not just making a choice. She might be an invert. She might be sick. The terminology varied. Some called it sexual inversion. Others used contrary sexual instinct. Later, the term lesbian would become standard, borrowed from the Greek island of Lesbos, where the poet Sappho lived and wrote love poetry to women in ancient times. But whatever term was used, the effect was the same. A new category of person had been created. The lesbian was now a type, an identity, a medical condition, not just a behavior or a choice, but something you were. And this changed everything. Before this medicalization, society could maintain comfortable ignorance. Two women living together, they are just friends. Two women exchanging passionate letters, women are naturally more emotional and expressive. Two women sleeping in the same bed for 30 years? Well, they are saving on heating costs, and besides, female friendship is so pure and innocent. But now doctors were saying, no, actually, some of these women are inverts. They have masculine souls in female bodies. They are attracted to women the way men are. Their relationships are not innocent friendships. They are homosexual relationships. Society could no longer pretend not to know. And once the innocence defense was gone, once there was language for acknowledging the sexual dimension of some women's relationships, those relationships became suspect, all of them, even the ones that genuinely were just intense friendships became vulnerable to reinterpretation as signs of pathology. Women started to police themselves and each other. College administrators began discouraging smashes, the intense friendships between students that had been common and accepted. Women's college faculty who lived together found their arrangements scrutinized. Letters that had been openly passionate became dangerous to write. The irony is painful. The very language that could have liberated women, the acknowledgement that yes, women can desire other women sexually, was being used to pathologize and control them. There was one particularly infamous case that shows how this worked in practice. In 1811, two women, Marianne Woods and Jane Perry, ran a boarding school in Edinburgh. A student made accusations that the two women were having a sexual relationship. The case went to court, and the judges ultimately decided that such a thing was impossible. Women could not have sexual relations with each other because they lacked the necessary anatomy. The accusation was dismissed as absurd. This was the old model, the assumption of female asexuality protecting women from accusations. But by the 1890s, that defense was gone. If the same case had happened 80 years later, Woods and Perrier would have been diagnosed as inverts, treated as mentally ill, possibly institutionalized. The very fact that they lived together and ran a school together would be seen as evidence of their condition. The medical model did not just change how society viewed women who loved women, it changed how women viewed themselves. Because now there was a category, an identity, a name for what they were experiencing, and that name came with a diagnosis of abnormality. Some women internalized this. They read the medical literature and thought, "Oh no, that describes me. I am sick, I am abnormal, I need to be cured." They sought treatment, underwent therapies, tried desperately to change their feelings. Others rejected it. They read the same literature and thought, "These doctors do not understand. What I feel is not sickness. It is love." They continued their relationships, but with more fear, more secrecy, more awareness that they were now labelled as deviant. And still others found the medical literature validating in an unexpected way, because finally there was acknowledgement that what they felt was real. Not just friendship, not just motion, but desire, attraction, love that was romantic and possibly sexual. Even if that acknowledgement came wrapped in pathology, it was still acknowledgement. This is one of the strange contradictions of sexology. By studying and categorizing homosexuality, by insisting it was real and distinct from heterosexuality, the sexologists inadvertently helped create the foundation for modern LGBTQ identity. They gave people language, community, self-understanding, even as they tried to cure them. But in the short term, in the decades around 1900, the effect was largely destructive. The safe space that romantic friendship had provided was closing. Women could no longer love each other openly without risking being labelled as inverts, as abnormal, as sick. The shift happened at different rates in different places and different communities. Working-class women were often subject to more scrutiny and harsher judgment. Upper-class women with sufficient resources could sometimes maintain their partnerships by being very discreet. Academic communities held out longer, but even they eventually succumbed to the pressure. By the 1920s, romantic friendship as a socially acceptable institution was essentially dead. The women who had formed those bonds in the 1880s and 90s might maintain them. They were grandfathered in, so to speak. But young women coming of age in the new century did not have the same freedom. If they loved other women, they now had to choose. They could try to suppress their feelings, marry men, live normal lives. Or they could accept the label of invert, of lesbian, and live in the underground communities that were beginning to form in major cities, communities that offered belonging and understanding but also risk and stigma. The medicalization also affected how families handled women's relationships. Before, a father might have been perfectly content with his daughter maintaining a close friendship with another woman, perhaps even living with her. But now that same father might read about sexual inversion in the newspaper and wonder, is my daughter one of these inverts? Should I be concerned about her friendship with Miss Smith? Families began intervening in ways they had not before, forbidding friendships they found too intense, sending daughters to doctors, arranging hasty marriages to cure suspected inversion. The surveillance increased, the pressure mounted, the space for loving shrank, and the doctors, well-meaning though many of them claimed to be, were not helping. The treatments they proposed were useless at best and harmful at worst. They recommended marriage, believing that heterosexual relations would cure inversion. They prescribed rest cures and isolation. Some even attempted more invasive medical interventions. None of it worked, of course, because there was nothing to cure. But women suffered through these treatments, desperate to be normal, to fit in, to not be sick. It is worth noting that not all doctors were hostile. Some, like Havelock Ellis, genuinely tried to advocate for more humane treatment of inverts. He argued against criminalization and harsh persecution. But even the sympathetic doctors still saw inversion as abnormality, as something's undesirable even if not criminal. The fundamental assumption that heterosexuality was natural and healthy while homosexuality was unnatural and pathological went unquestioned. And that assumption would shape medical and psychiatric treatment of LGBTQ people for the next 70 years, until homosexuality was finally removed from the diagnostic manual in 1973. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1900, in the immediate aftermath of medicalization, women were struggling to adapt to this new reality. The old strategies did not work anymore. The old language was now suspect. The old freedoms were being curtailed, and yet women continued to love each other. They found new ways, new strategies, new communities. They went underground when they had to. They learned to code their language even more carefully. They created spaces, certain neighborhoods, certain bars, certain social circles, where they could be themselves. The bonds did not disappear, the love did not stop. It just became more dangerous, more hidden, more defiant. Women who chose each other after 1900 were making a different choice than their mothers and grandmothers had made. They were consciously rejecting the medical model, the social expectations, the pressure to conform. And some of those women channeled their defiance into activism. They looked at the system that was trying to pathologize them and decided to fight back. They joined suffrage movements, social reform movements, labor movements. They worked to change the conditions of women's lives, to expand women's rights and freedoms, because they understood something crucial. The medicalization of love between women was not separate from other forms of women's oppression. It was connected to the same patriarchal structures that denied women the vote, that kept them out of professions, that gave husbands legal control over their wives. If women had real economic independence, if they had political power, if they had legal rights, they would have more freedom to love whom they chose. The fight for women's rights and the fight for the freedom to love women were the same fight, even if most suffragists did not acknowledge it openly. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating and under-discussed aspects of the suffrage movement. How many suffragists were in relationships with women? How many of those partnerships sustained the exhausting work of political activism? And why did the movement stay so quiet about it? The answers reveal both the strength of women's bonds and the limitations imposed by respectability politics, because the women fighting for the vote understood that their personal lives could be weaponized against them, that accusations of inversion could destroy their political credibility. So they loved each other quietly, supported each other privately, and in public presented themselves as exactly what society expected. Devoted friends, nothing more. But the love was there. The partnerships were there. And they were crucial to making the movement possible. Let me show you just how deeply romantic partnerships were woven into the fabric of the women's rights movement, and how the need to hide those partnerships shaped the politics of an entire generation. Look closely at the photographs from suffrage marches in the early 1900s. Women in white dresses, carrying banners, marching for the vote. Their faces are determined, proud, defiant. But look closer. See how some women are walking arm in arm? See how certain pairs always appear together in photographs, standing close, their shoulders touching. See the intensity in their gazes when they look at each other. Those partnerships, those bonds between women fighting side by side, were often more than political alliances. They were love, and that love sustained one of the most important social movements in history. But you will not read about it in most history books, because the suffragists themselves worked very hard to hide it. The fight for women's right to vote was already controversial enough. The suffragists faced mockery, violence, imprisonment. They were called unfeminine, unnatural, dangerous. The last thing they needed was accusations that they were inverts, that the movement was full of women who loved other women instead of men. So they stayed quiet about their partnerships. They used the language of friendship. They presented themselves as respectable, conventional women who just happened to want the vote. And in the process, they erased a crucial part of their own story. Let me show you what was really happening behind the scenes. Jane Addams, founder of Hull House in Chicago and winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, was one of the most famous reformers of her era. Her settlement house provided services to immigrants and the poor. She wrote influential books on social reform. She advocated for women's suffrage, labor rights and peace. She was respected, celebrated, considered a model of progressive feminism. And for 40 years, she lived with Mary Rosé Smith. Mary was wealthy, the daughter of a prominent Chicago family. She met Jane in 1890, visited Hull House, and was immediately drawn into the work. But she was more drawn to Jane herself. Within a few years, Mary had essentially moved into Hull House. She and Jane shared a bedroom. They travelled together. They made all major decisions jointly. Mary funded much of Hull House's work with her own money. She managed the household, handled correspondence, protected Jane from stress and overwork. She was, in every meaningful sense, Jane's partner. Her wife, though they could never use that word. Jane's letters to Mary are passionate and devoted. She writes about missing Mary when they are apart, about longing to be home with her, about how Mary makes everything in her life better. She signs letters, "Your loving Jane," and "Devotedly yours." Their friends knew, everyone close to them knew, but in public Mary was described as Jane's dear friend or generous benefactor. The nature of their relationship was carefully obscured. Why? Because Jane understood that if she was too open about loving Mary, it could destroy her political effectiveness. The suffrage movement, the peace movement, the reform work she cared about, all of it could be undermined if she was labelled a sexual invert. So she used the old language of romantic friendship, even though that framework was crumbling around her. She maintained respectability. She protected the movement. But it cost her. When Mary died in 1934, Jane was devastated. She died herself just a year later, at age 74. At her funeral, there was no acknowledgement of what Mary had meant to her. No recognition of their 4-decade partnership. Mary was mentioned as a friend, a supporter, nothing more. Jane took the truth of their love to her grave, and historians for decades accepted the public story. Only in recent years have scholars started to acknowledge that Jane and Mary were almost certainly in a romantic and probably sexual relationship. The same pattern appears throughout the suffrage movement. Look at the leadership and you find pairs of women. Sometimes they lived together openly, sometimes their partnerships were more discreet. but the bonds were there, providing emotional support, financial stability, intellectual companionship. Frances Willard, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and a major figure in the suffrage movement, lived for decades with Anna Gordon. They travelled together, worked together, shared everything. Anna managed Frances's schedule, protected her health, handled the practical details of her exhausting advocacy work. When Frances died in 1898, Anna was shattered. She spent the rest of her life carrying on Frances's work and preserving her legacy. But the nature of their relationship was never officially acknowledged. Anna was the devoted secretary, the loyal friend, nothing more. Or consider Carrie Chapman Catt, who led the final push for suffrage in America and saw the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. Carrie was married twice, both times to men who died relatively young. After her second husband's death in 1905, Carrie lived with Mary Garrett Hay for the rest of her life. Mary was a skilled political organiser who worked closely with Carrie on suffrage campaigns. They lived together for over 20 years. They were inseparable. Their correspondence shows deep affection and devotion. But again, publicly, they were just colleagues, just friends. Carrie even wrote in her autobiography about the importance of women's friendships, about how romantic friendship had sustained her through difficult times. She was using the old language, the old framework, even in the 1920s when it was no longer really safe to do so. Why did these women hide? Why not be open about their partnerships? The answer is both practical and painful. They believed, probably correctly, that being too open would give their opponents ammunition. Anti-suffrage forces already attacked suffragists as unfeminine, as wanting to be men, as rejecting their natural roles. If it became widely known that many suffrage leaders were in romantic partnerships with women, those attacks would intensify. The suffragists would be labelled as inverts trying to corrupt normal women. The movement would be dismissed as the pet project of abnormal women with perverted desires. All the careful work of presenting suffrage as a respectable, rational reform would be undone. So the leaders made a strategic decision. They would hide their personal lives. They would maintain the fiction of devoted friendship. They would sacrifice openness about their own loves for the sake of the larger cause. And it worked, in a sense. The suffrage movement succeeded. Women got the vote in 1920. That was a huge victory, achieved partly because the movement managed to maintain respectability. But the cost was the erasure of these relationships from public memory. The women who fought for suffrage, who were sustained by their partnerships with other women, who loved each other deeply, their stories were hidden, distorted, or simply lost. And there is something else, something more troubling. The suffrage movement's respectability strategy meant it could not openly advocate for women who loved women. It could not challenge the medicalization we talked about earlier. It could not fight against the pathologizing of female partnerships. In fact, some suffragists actively distanced themselves from any suggestion of inversion. They emphasized their femininity, their maternal instincts, their support for traditional family values, everything except the reality of their own lives. This created a strange contradiction. The movement was full of women in the same-sex partnerships, but it could not acknowledge or defend those partnerships. It fought for women's rights, but not for the right to love other women openly. Some historians argue this was necessary, that the movement could not fight every battle at once. Others see it as a betrayal, a failure to stand up for a part of the community. I think it was both. It was a necessary compromise that came at a real cost. The women who made that compromise were brave, strategic, and effective, but they also erased something true and important about themselves and their community. Now, not every suffragist was in a same-sex partnership, obviously. Many were married to men, many were genuinely heterosexual. but the proportion of suffrage leaders who were in partnerships with women is striking. Far higher than you would expect if these were just random friendships. Why? Probably because women in same-sex partnerships had strong motivations to fight for women's rights. They understood viscerally how limited women's legal status was. They knew what it meant to have no legal protection for their relationships. They had experienced the vulnerability of being economically dependent, socially marginal, legally powerless. So they fought. They worked tirelessly for suffrage, for property rights, for access to education and professions. They understood that women's independence was not just an abstract political goal. It was personal, it was survival, and their partnerships made the work possible. Think about what it takes to sustain decades of activism. The long hours, the constant travel, the public attacks, the slow progress, the setbacks and disappointments. You need support. You need someone who believes in you, who takes care of you, who shares the burden. For these women, that someone was another woman. Their partner was also their political ally, their intellectual companion, their emotional anchor. The personal and political were completely intertwined. There is a particularly interesting case I want to tell you about, because it shows both the power and the complexity of these partnerships. Mary Woolley was president of Mount Holyoke College from 1901 to 1937. She was a brilliant administrator and a committed advocate for women's education and peace activism. She lived with Janet Marks, a professor of English literature, for over 50 years. They shared a home, they travelled together, they were publicly acknowledged as a couple within their academic community. But here is where it gets complicated. In 1908, Jeanette wrote an essay called Unwise College Friendships, unpublished, but preserved in her papers. In it, she warned against romantic attachments between women, calling them potentially harmful and inappropriate. What was she doing? Was she trying to protect herself and Mary by distancing them from the newer, more sexual understanding of women's partnerships? Was she genuinely conflicted about her own feelings? Was she trying to police other women's relationships while preserving her own? We do not know for certain, but the essay reveals the tension these women lived with. Even those who were in long-term partnerships with women, even those who were relatively open about it, felt pressure to deny or minimize the romantic and sexual dimensions of those relationships. The suffrage era, roughly 1890 to 1920, was a period of enormous gains for women's rights. But it was also a period when the space for openly loving women was shrinking rapidly. The old model of romantic friendship was dying. The new model of lesbian identity was emerging, but it was pathologized and stigmatized. Women caught in that transition had to navigate carefully. They had to find ways to maintain their partnerships while avoiding the invert label. They had to fight for women's political rights while staying quiet about their own personal lives. Some managed this successfully. Jane Addams and Mary Rosé Smith had a genuinely happy partnership that lasted 4 decades. Carrie Chapman Catt and Mary Garrett Hay supported each other through years of exhausting political work. These relationships endured, even if they could not be fully acknowledged. Others found the pressure unbearable. There are cases of women who ended their partnerships with women to marry men, seeking the safety and respectability of heterosexual marriage. There are cases of women who suffered depression, anxiety and illness from the stress of hiding. And there are cases of women who simply disappeared from history. We know they were part of suffrage organizations, that they worked alongside the famous leaders, that they were in partnerships with other women. But their names are lost, their stories forgotten, because they were not famous enough for historians to pay attention to them later. The movement's success, getting women the vote, was real and important. It changed women's lives, opened doors, created possibilities. But it did not change society's attitude toward women loving women. If anything, that got worse in the 1920s and 30s as the medicalization we discussed earlier became more entrenched. So the women who had fought for suffrage, who had given years of their lives to the cause, who had loved each other through it all, they got the vote, but they did not get acceptance. They got political rights, but not social freedom. That gap between political progress and personal freedom is one of the themes running through this entire story. Women found ways to claim space, to build lives together, to love each other, but every gain was partial, every freedom was limited, every victory came with compromises and costs. The suffragists' strategy of respectability, of hiding their partnerships, of maintaining the fiction of devoted friendship, it got them the vote. But it also meant that future generations did not inherit a clear history of women's love for each other being part of progressive politics. Instead, LGBTQ rights and feminism have often been seen as separate movements, sometimes even in tension with each other. The historical connection, the fact that many early feminists were women who loved women, that their partnerships sustained their activism, has been obscured. We're only now beginning to recover that history, to acknowledge what was always there but carefully hidden, to recognize that the women who fought for our rights were often fighting for their own freedom to love, even if they could not say so openly. And this brings us to the final question we need to address tonight. What happened to all of this? What is the legacy of Victorian women's forbidden friendships? How did we get from there to here? And what can those 19th century women, with their hair jewellery and coded letters, their romantic friendships and Boston marriages, their heartbreaks and their triumphs, what can they teach us about love, identity and the ongoing struggle for freedom? Those are the questions we turn to now in our final moments together. In 1933, a woman named Helena Whitbread sat in the Halifax archives in Yorkshire, England, holding a small notebook filled with indecipherable symbols. She had been researching local history when an archivist mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that they had diaries written by Anne Lister, but much of it was in code that no one had fully translated since the 1890s. Helena asked to see them, and what she found would change our understanding of Victorian women's lives forever. But here is the thing. Those diaries had been sitting in that archive for over 50 years, available to researchers, catalogued, known about, and almost no one had bothered to decode them fully. The few who had started the work in the 1890s had been so shocked by the content that they recommended the diaries be destroyed. They were not destroyed, but they were ignored, buried, forgotten. Because the story they told of a woman who loved women, who lived openly as she could, who married another woman in everything but law, that story did not fit the narrative that 20th century society wanted to tell about the past. And Anne Lister's diaries are just one example. Across England and America, in attics and estate sales and library storage rooms, similar stories were being lost. Letters burned, photographs separated, diaries destroyed, wills altered. The evidence of women's love for each other systematically erased. Why? What were people so afraid of? I think they were afraid of exactly what we've been talking about tonight. That women could love each other deeply, passionately, completely. That women could build lives together without mere men. That the official steer about heterosexual marriage being the only form of love that mattered, about women needing men to be complete, was not the whole truth. So they rewrote history. They took women who had lived with female companions for decades and called them spinsters. They took passionate letters and labelled them as excessive female sentiment. They took partnerships that looked like marriages and insisted they were just friendships. They straightwashed the past. And it worked. For most of the 20th century, the story of Victorian women's relationships was told as a story of innocent friendship that modern people were misreading with their dirty minds. The idea that women in the 1800s could have been in love with each other, could have been sexual with each other, was dismissed as anachronistic projection. But then researchers like Helena Whitbread started actually reading the primary sources, actually decoding the diaries, actually taking women's own words seriously. And what they found was undeniable. These women were not just friends, they were lovers, they were partners, they were building lives together in whatever ways their society would permit. And when their society stopped permitting it, when the medical establishment pathologized them and the culture turned against them, they went underground, but they did not disappear. The publication of Anne Lister's decoded diaries in 1988 was a watershed moment. Here was documentary evidence in a woman's own hand describing her sexual relationships with women in the 1820s and 30s. No ambiguity, room for reinterpretation. She was a lesbian by any definition, and she lived over 150 years ago. This forced a reckoning. Historians had to acknowledge that LGBTQ people were not a modern invention. They had always existed. They had always found ways to love each other, to build communities, to survive. And once scholars started looking with open eyes, the evidence was everywhere. The hair jewellery that women wore for decades, often from women, not men. The letters that used language of romantic and sexual longing between women. The partnerships that lasted for 50 years. The wills leaving everything to a dear friend. The photographs of women in couples, their body language unmistakable. All of it had been there all along, visible in archives, in museums, in family attics. But people had chosen not to see it. Or they had seen it and deliberately obscured it. The recovery of this history is still ongoing. Even now, researchers are finding new collections of letters, new diaries, new evidence of Victorian women loving women. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Each story recovered is a small victory against erasure. But we have to ask, how much has been permanently lost? How many letters were actually burned when women were told to destroy them? How many diaries were thrown away by scandalized relatives? How many photographs were separated, names removed from the backs, stories deliberately forgotten? We will never know the full extent of what was erased, but we know it was substantial. For every Anne Lister whose diaries survived, how many other women's stories disappeared entirely? And here is what makes this particularly painful. These women documented their lives. They wrote letters, kept diaries, took photographs, made wills, left records. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their relationships acknowledged. They left evidence deliberately, even knowing it might be dangerous. And then that evidence was destroyed by people who thought they were protecting family honour, or maintaining decency, or preventing scandal. People who could not imagine that future generations might actually want to know these stories, might need to know them, because we do need them. LGBTQ people today need to know that we have always existed, that our ancestors found ways to love each other even in hostile times, that we come from a long history of courage and creativity and resilience. And everyone needs to know that human relationships are more complex, more varied, more beautiful than the narrow scripts we are given. That there have always been multiple ways to love, to partner, to build a life. That the rigid categories we try to impose, straight or gay, friends or lovers, often cannot contain the reality of human connection. Victorian women's friendships existed in the space between those categories. Some were what we would now call lesbian relationships. Others were deep friendships without a sexual component. Many were something in between, something we do not have good language for even now. And that ambiguity, that refusal to fit neatly into boxes, is actually one of the most valuable things about these stories. They remind us that human experience exceeds our categories, that love is stranger and more various than any definition we can make. The women we have met tonight, Eleanor and Sarah in their Welsh cottage, Anne Lister with her coded diaries, The anonymous women exchanging hair jewelry, the Boston marriage couples, Charlotte Cushman on stage, the suffragists hiding their partnerships, they were all navigating the same basic problem. How do you live authentically in a world that does not have space for who you are? They found ways, imperfect ways, compromised ways, ways that required hiding and coding and careful navigation of social boundaries, but they found ways. They loved each other. They built lives together. They survived. And in surviving, in leaving evidence behind, in refusing to be completely erased, they gave us something precious. They gave us history. They gave us ancestors. They gave us proof that what we feel, what we are, is not new or wrong or unnatural. It is part of the long story of human love and connection. But the legacy is not just for LGBTQ people, because what these women proved is that when you give women education, economic independence, and freedom of association, many of them will choose each other. They will form bonds that sustain them more than marriage to men does. They will prioritize their relationships with other women. This was threatening in the Victorian era. It remains threatening now, because it suggests that heterosexual marriage is not the only option, not even necessarily the best option for many women. That women might be perfectly happy, perfectly fulfilled, in partnerships with each other or living independently. The backlash against Victorian women's friendships, the medicalization, the pathologizing, the insistence that these relationships were sick and abnormal, was not really about sex. It was about power. It was about preventing women from finding alternatives to patriarchal marriage. And the erasure of this history in the 20th century served the same function. If we do not know that women in the past loved each other and built lives together, if we think LGBTQ identity is a modern invention, then we cannot learn from their strategies. We cannot build on their foundations. We start from scratch over and over again. But now we know the history has been recovered, or at least significant portions of it. We know about Anne Lister and the ladies of Llangollen and the Boston marriages and all the rest. We know that our ancestors existed, that they loved, that they survived. What do we do with that knowledge? I think we honor it by telling these stories, by refusing to let them be erased again, by teaching them in schools, by writing books and making television shows and creating art that brings these women back to life, by insisting that they matter, that their lives and loves were real and valuable. The BBC series Gentleman Jack, which brought Anne Lister's story to television in 2019, was watched by millions of people around the world. Many viewers had never heard of Anne Lister before. Many had no idea that women in the 1800s could live the way Anne did. The show was a revelation, and that is what good historical recovery can do. It can change how people understand the past, and in doing so, change how they understand the present. It can give LGBTQ people ancestors and history. It can show everyone that the world has always been more diverse, more complex, more interesting than the official story suggested. But we also have to be careful not to romanticize. Victorian women's relationships existed within severe constraints. They were always vulnerable to separation, to social condemnation, to medical pathologizing. The women who built lives together did so at real cost. Many lived with constant fear. Many were separated from families who rejected them. Many internalized the message that they were abnormal. The freedom they managed to claim was partial, precarious, always in danger. It was not the full liberation we hope for now. It was survival, creativity, making the best of impossible circumstances. And that is also part of the legacy. The reminder that progress is not inevitable, that freedoms once gained can be lost, that every generation has to fight to protect and expand the space for people to love whom they choose. The Victorian women who loved each other taught us that. They showed us both what is possible, the extraordinary creativity humans employ to love each other, against all odds. And what can be taken away, how quickly acceptance can turn to condemnation, how easily history can be erased. So we remember, we tell the stories, we refuse to let them disappear again. We claim these women as our ancestors, our inspiration, our proof that we have always been here. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding how they navigated their impossible situations, we can better navigate our own. By seeing how they created space to love within rigid constraints, we can learn to create space in our own times. By honouring their courage, their creativity, their refusal to be completely erased, we can find courage for our own struggles. Because the fight is not over. LGBTQ rights are still contested. Women's autonomy is still under attack. The freedom to love whom you choose, to build the life you want, to be recognised and respected for who you are, these are still things people have to fight for. But we fight with the knowledge that we are not the first. That women in the 1800s loved each other and survived to tell about it. That they left us evidence, left us stories, left us proof that it is possible to be true to yourself even in the hardest times. And that is the real legacy of Victorian women's forbidden friendships. Not just the historical record, important though that is, but the lesson that love finds a way, that humans are endlessly creative in building the lives they need, that what looks impossible from the outside might actually be survivable, even beautiful, from the inside. Those Victorian women, with their hair jewellery and coded diaries, their romantic friendships and secret marriages, their public faces and private truths, they were doing the best they could with what they had. And what they had was each other. And somehow that was enough. They loved. They survived. They left evidence. And now, over a century later, we can read their letters, decode their diaries, look at their photographs and know they were here, they were real, they were us. And that knowledge, that connection across time, that sense of belonging to a long history of people who loved against all odds, that is precious. That is worth fighting to preserve. That is why we tell these stories. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, think about those Victorian women. Think about Eleanor and Sarah in their Welsh cottage, celebrating 50 years together. Think about Anne Lister, encoding her truth for future generations to find. Think about the anonymous women exchanging locks of hair, wearing their love literally close to their hearts. Think about all the partnerships that sustained women through the fight for suffrage, for rights, for freedom. They were extraordinary, but they were also ordinary, just people trying to love and be loved, trying to build lives worth living. Just like us, separated by a century and a half, but connected by the fundamental human need for connection, for intimacy, for being seen and known and chosen by another person. Their stories matter. They will always matter. And by remembering them, by telling their stories, by refusing to let them be erased, we keep them alive. We honour what they fought for. We build on what they began. Thank you for spending these hours with me tonight, for listening to these stories, for caring about these women and their loves. I hope you found something here that resonated with you, something that made you think differently about history, about love, about what is possible even in impossible times. These stories are just the beginning. There are so many more waiting to be discovered, to be told, to be remembered. The archives are full of them. The past is full of them. People who loved bravely in hard times, who left traces for us to find. And we will keep finding them. We will keep telling their stories. We will keep insisting that they matter, that they were real, that they were here because they were, and so are we. Sleep well, dear friends. And when you wake, remember, You are part of a long history of people who insisted on loving in their own way, on their own terms. You are not alone. You've never been alone. The ancestors are with us. Their love endures. Until we meet again for another story, another journey into history's hidden corners, good night.